Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Veil of the Silent Board. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghost stories were just stories, fabrications meant to scare children and amuse adults. But that night changed everything. It began innocuously enough, with a group of us gathered in my cramped college apartment, the kind of place where the peeling wallpaper and flickering fluorescent light might already make you question your sanity. We were a mix of skeptics and thrill seekers, each daring the others to prove whether the veil between the living and the dead could be pierced. Someone brought the Ouija board, an old relic found at a thrift shop downtown. It was cheap plywood with faded letters and numbers printed in curling script around the edges. The planchette was a simple heart-shaped piece of wood with a small glass window in its center. Nobody expected anything to happen, really. We joked, poked, and prodded the board before settling into a circle on the worn carpet. I remember the air felt heavier than usual, a kind of stale thickness that seemed to press in on us. The lights were dimmed, and only the weak glow from a single lamp spilled across the floor. My heart thudded oddly, an anxious rhythm I tried to ignore. "Who's there?" someone asked, their voice barely above a whisper. Our fingers hovered nervously over the planchette, but would cool under our touch. Minutes passed with nothing but silence, then the planchette began to move. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it slid from the center toward the letter Y. We laughed it off, accusing each other of pushing it, but no one admitted to making contact. "Are you real?" another voice asked, a hint of nervous excitement breaking through the tension. The planchette moved again, this time spelling out an O. A chill ran down my spine, though I fought to keep my expression neutral. It was probably someone messing with us, trying to get a rise out of the group. Still, the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. "What's your name?" The planchette moved quickly now, sliding out letters that spelled ELI. I frowned. None of us had said anything close to that name. One of the girls shook her head, her eyes wide. "I've never heard of that," she said. "Maybe it's the spirit's name," I suggested, trying to sound logical. "Eli could be a common name." The board fell silent again, the planchette resting at the edge near the number 7. We kept asking questions, trying to coax more from this mysterious Eli. The answers came, but they were cryptic and unsettling. Eli spoke of loneliness, of being trapped, of wanting to be freed. Then came the warning. "Don't trust her." The letters appeared abruptly, jarring in contrast to the slow, measured movements before. Everyone looked around, confusion and unease rippling through the group. We weren't sure who it was. None of us had mentioned anyone else. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The room, already thick with tension, felt suffocating now. "Who is her?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. The planchette moved again. SRH. Sarah was one of my closest friends, sitting across from me, her face pale in the dim light. She laughed nervously and shook her head. "Come on, this has to be someone messing with us." But no one said a word to accuse anyone directly. We ended the session shortly after that, laughter forced and brittle as we packed away the board. I thought that would be the end of it, the usual prank, the kind of story we might laugh about later. But the unease didn't lift. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. At first, it was minor. I would catch glimpses of movement from the corner of my eye, only to find empty hallways or rooms. My phone would buzz with texts from unknown numbers, messages that said nothing but a single letter, like he or L. Sarah called me once, voice trembling, to say she had been having nightmares about a dark figure watching her from the shadows. One evening, I was alone in my apartment when the power cut out. Total blackness swallowed the room, save for the faint glow of my phone screen. I reached out blindly, trying to find the flashlight app, when I felt something brush lightly against my arm, almost like a sigh of cold air. I snapped on the flashlight and shone it around. Nothing. Just the empty room. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself it was all my imagination. But then I heard it, a whisper, just beyond audible range, repeating a name, Eli. I told myself to stop, that I was going insane. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The next day, I found a note slipped under my door. In shaky handwriting, it read, "Help me." I showed it to Sarah and the others, but they shrugged it off as a prank. Maybe it was. But I knew better. I started to dig into the name Eli, searching local records and obituaries. What I found unsettled me. Years ago, a young man named Eli had died under mysterious circumstances not far from where we lived. The details were sparse, but there was mention of a troubled mind and a woman named Sarah who had been close to him. I confronted Sarah about it, but she denied any connection. Her eyes were guarded, and I sensed she was hiding something. That night, I heard the whispers again, louder now, calling me to the old abandoned house on the edge of town. My heart hammered as I debated whether to go. Something compelled me forward, a mixture of fear and curiosity I couldn't resist. When I arrived, the house loomed like a dark monument, its windows shattered and doors hanging ajar. The air was thick with decay and silence. Inside, the shadows seemed to shift and dance, and I could feel a presence watching me. In the center of the dusty floor lay the Ouija board, glowing faintly as if waiting. I didn't want to touch it, but my fingers moved of their own accord. The planchette slid beneath my hand, spelling out one final message. Set me free. And then the room went cold. The night air pressed against the window pane, chilled and heavy with the scent of rain that had yet to fall. I sat on the edge of the worn-out armchair, the Ouija board resting on the small table before me, its glossy surface catching the dim glow of the single lamp in the room. The planchette lay motionless, innocuous, and still. I told myself it was just wood and paint, just a game for foolish teenagers or gullible thrill-seekers. But the unease niggling at the back of my mind wouldn't let me believe that. I hadn't wanted to come here tonight. The house felt wrong the moment I stepped inside, as if the walls themselves were watching and waiting, but I was desperate to understand what had happened the last time I used the board. The memory of that evening, when the letters spelled out something that didn't belong to any person I knew, had haunted my dreams, twisting into nightmares that left me gasping awake. The board had been in the attic, tucked away in an old trunk with faded photographs and brittle letters. I found it by accident, a curious relic from a past no one around here wanted to talk about. And yet, as I traced my fingers over the letters and the words printed beneath, a shiver crawled up my spine. What if it wasn't just a game? What if something had been waiting, coaxed out by my own foolishness? I reached out and placed my fingers lightly on the planchette. My pulse quickened, breath shallow. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the settling house. I closed my eyes for a moment, willing myself to stay calm. "Is anyone there?" I whispered. Nothing moved. I opened my eyes and watched the planchette. It hovered still. I tried again. "Please, I don't want any tricks. Just tell me your name." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the planchette slid forward. It was subtle, barely a motion, but I saw it. A tremor of fear flickered through me. I fought the urge to pull away, to laugh this off as a trick of my imagination. It moved again, this time more confidently, and stopped over the letter M. "M," I whispered. then to A. And A. The letters spelled a name, but it wasn't one I recognized immediately. I asked, "Who are you?" The planchette moved, spelling out 𝐼NGRAM. Ingram. The name sounded familiar, like something I'd heard in passing, maybe from the old town records. There was an Ingram family that had lived here generations ago, but none of them were spoken of fondly. Rumors of tragedy, madness whispered in the same breath. I swallowed hard and kept pressing. "What do you want?" The planchette glided to HELP. I felt a cold rush, like the breath of something unseen in the small room. It was one thing to call out to a name, another to hear a plea. Help with what? I asked, voice barely above a whisper. The letters began to shuffle, slower now, hesitant. ESCAPE. Escape. My heart hammered. Escape from what? The house? The afterlife? Or something darker? I gripped the edge of the table, the wood biting into my palms. Why are you trapped? I pressed. The planchette circled over letters that formed another word, simpler but heavier with meaning. CURSE. A curse. I sat back, tension unraveling in my shoulders. The stories about the Ingrams weren't just gossip, they might be warnings. The last thing I wanted was to invite some ancient curse into my life, but it was too late for regrets. I closed the board and stood, pacing the room. My mind raced with questions. Was Ingram really here, reaching out through the veil? Or was this some trick my mind was playing on me, desperate for meaning in the shadows? The heater clicked off, plunging the room into darker silence. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long, fickle shadows through the blinds. I could have sworn I heard something, a faint scratching at the door, or maybe a whisper tarried in the draft. I froze. My breath caught. The rational part of me screamed to dismiss it, to dismiss everything. But the rest of me knew better. There was something in this house, something awake, and it wasn't going anywhere. I needed to find out more about the Ingrams. About the curse. About why I awakened. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside into the cold night, the wet grass soaking my shoes as I made my way down the familiar path to the town library. The building was closed, the windows dark, but I wasn't about to let simple obstacles stop me. I circled around to the back, where the small side door was sometimes left unlocked late at night. Tonight, it was ajar. I slipped inside, heart pounding, the musty smell of old books filling my nostrils. I moved quickly, heading for the local history archives. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight as I rifled through brittle newspaper clippings and faded photographs. There was an article from decades ago, yellowed and fragile. Ingram family tragedy, 3 found dead in their home, cause unknown. Local authorities baffled by the circumstances. I read on, feeling the weight of the words settling on me. The house, the family, the tragedy, it all tied together like a knot in my stomach. The article hinted at strange happenings, unexplained phenomena around the property. I pocketed the clipping and a few other notes, then slipped back into the night, the air colder now, sharper. The house waiting for me. When I returned, the front door creaked open before I even touched it. A warning or an invitation? I couldn't tell. Inside, the silence was thicker, almost suffocating. I placed the clippings on the table beside the Ouija board, the pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. Suddenly, the lamp flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. My breath hitched. The planchette quivered on the board. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I stayed, rooted by a mixture of fear and something darker, curiosity edged with dread. The planchette moved again. this time, slowly, deliberately. It spelled out a single word. Welcome. I didn't know whether to be terrified or resigned. The house, the board, the name Ingram, they were all part of something I'd stumbled into. Something with no clear end. And as the shadows deepened around me, I realized I might never leave this house the same as before. The morning sun barely pierced the grimy windows of the old house, casting long, sickly shadows across the peeling wallpaper. I woke up on the threadbare couch in the living room, head pounding and throat dry as if I'd swallowed sand. The events of the night before pressed on me heavily, the Ouija board, the sudden chill, the way the planchette had jerked as if possessed by some unseen force. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I'd awakened wasn't done with me yet. I had stayed up half the night trying to make sense of what had happened. The board had spelled out something that didn't quite make sense at first, L-E-A-V-E. But then, just as abruptly, it shifted to S-T-A-Y. The conflicting messages gnawed at me. Was it a warning or a lure? The idea that something was trying to communicate, to pull me deeper into its world, was unsettling, but also strangely compelling. I got to my feet, limping slightly from the cramp that had seized my left leg overnight. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of old wood settling. I wanted to leave, to get as far from this place as possible, but the key to the front door was missing. It must have fallen somewhere during last night's chaos. I cursed under my breath. Being trapped in this house with whatever I'd unleashed was not something I wanted to test. I decided I needed more information. Maybe the previous owner's journals I'd found stuffed in the attic could shed some light on the history of this place. I climbed the stairs cautiously, each step moaning under my weight. The attic door was, as I left it, ajar, revealing the dusty chaos within. I grabbed the leather-bound notebook from the corner where I'd left it and blew off the thick layer of dust. The smell of mildew and old paper filled my nostrils. Flipping through the brittle pages, I found entries dating back decades. The handwriting was frantic, the ink smeared in places as if the writer had been shaking or crying. The earliest entries spoke of a man named Samuel Granger, who had moved into the house in the 1920s. He was obsessed with contacting the dead, convinced that the spirits of his deceased wife and child lingered in the house. The journals detailed his experiments with seances, strange rituals, and finally, his use of a Ouija board almost exactly like the one I had found. One passage caught my eye. They come when the board calls. The shadows move and whisper my name. I warn them, leave this place. But they do not listen. Now the house bleeds with their fear. It was chilling, especially in light of what I had experienced. The last few entries grew increasingly erratic, ending abruptly with the words, "Do not trust the movements. The voice is a lie." I closed the book and sat back against the dusty wall. The more I read, the more I felt like Samuel Granger had been in the same position I was now, curious and desperate, but ultimately trapped by his own fascination with the supernatural. A sudden noise snapped me out of my reverie. It was a soft tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood, coming from the floor below. My heart hammered against my ribs. I told myself it was just the house settling, but the rhythm was too deliberate to be random. With the journal clutched in my hand, I crept down the stairs, trying to make as little noise as possible. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the parlor, the same room where I'd found the Ouija board. When I pushed open the door, I saw the board resting on the table, the planchette moving slowly in circles, as if tracing invisible symbols in the air. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, my breath visible in the cold. "Who's there?" I demanded, voice shaking more than I wanted to admit. The board didn't answer, but the planchette suddenly shot across the letters, spelling out a single word, "trapped." I swallowed hard, my palms sweaty. The notion was terrifying. Was I the one trapped, or was it the restless spirit tied to this place? I wanted to disrupt whatever was happening, to break the connection and end the torment, but I also feared provoking it further. In my hesitation, the front door slammed shut upstairs with a deafening bang, making me jump. An oppressive silence followed, thick and suffocating. Then, faint whispers began to swirl around me, unintelligible at first but gradually forming words. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Help us, find the truth, break the cycle. The voice was fragile, desperate, and it pierced my soul. I dropped to my knees, overcome by a wave of emotion I didn't understand. There was a plea in those words, a hint that I might be able to do something more than just survive. I knew then that the house was more than a simple ghost story. It was a prison for something or someone, and the Ouija board was the key, both a lock and a link. I had to decide whether to run and never look back or to delve deeper into this nightmare, to uncover the story buried beneath the wood in dust and shadows. As the planchette continued its slow, relentless dance across the board, I realized that whatever choice I made, there was no going back to ignorance. The house was watching me, waiting. And the spirits inside were counting on me. I woke to an oppressive silence pressing down on the room, the kind of heavy quiet that feels unnatural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The early morning light filtered weakly through the cracked blinds, casting long, sickly shadows across the peeling wallpaper. I lay still in bed, heart pounding, trying to will my eyes open. My body felt like it had been dragged through mud overnight, drained, heavy, and sticky with sweat. Last night's events played over in my mind with the slow, disjointed rhythm of a nightmare I couldn't quite shake. The Ouija board had been set up on the floor between me and Daniel, its glossy surface gleaming faintly in the dark, the planchette moving with a will of its own. We tried to laugh it off, to treat it like a game, but deep down I knew something had shifted. The air had grown thick around us, charged with a kind of static electricity that made my skin prickle. When the board spelled out leave, I wanted nothing more than to grab Daniel's hand and run. But then the knocking started. Soft at first, like a hesitant tap on the window, then louder, more insistent. It came from the basement, an old place we'd avoided since moving in, full of dusty boxes and cobwebs. The sound pulsed through the floorboards beneath us, a heartbeat out of sync with the world. Daniel tried to convince me it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind. But I knew better. I had been wrong not to leave. Now, as I sat up in bed, I noticed the Ouija board lying face down on the floor near the door. The planchette rested on the carpet, a cold, ominous presence in the dim light. I didn't remember walking over to it. Had I been sleepwalking? Or had someone moved it? I forced myself out of bed, my legs trembling as I reached for the light switch. The bulb flickered once, twice, then steadied, illuminating the room in a harsh, sterile glow. I looked around, half expecting to see Daniel, but he was nowhere in sight. The house felt empty, but I knew it wasn't. Not really. I found my shoes by the door and slipped them on, the familiar leather somehow grounding me. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. The air was colder here, heavier. A faint, acrid smell lingered like burnt rubber mixed with damp earth. The knocking had stopped, but a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor and up into my chest. I moved toward the basement door at the end of the hall, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. It was cold, almost icy, and resistance met my grip as if the door itself were fighting me. I pulled harder and it creaked open, revealing the darkness beyond. I flicked the light switch inside the basement, but nothing happened. The bulb was dead, or maybe the power was out. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, the screen lighting up with a weak glow. I switched on the flashlight and stepped down the stairs, each creak echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with moisture and decay. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, their surfaces coated in dust. As I moved deeper, The smell grew stronger, and I realized it wasn't just burnt rubber anymore. There was something else, something metallic, sharp, like blood. Then I saw it. A smear of dark red on the concrete floor, glistening faintly in the beam of my flashlight. I knelt down, heart hammering, and touched the stain with my finger. It was sticky, warm, fresh. That's when I heard it, a low whisper, drifting through the basement like a breeze. I spun around, eyes wide, but there was no one there. The whisper grew louder, a string of unintelligible words that made my skin crawl. I tried to follow the voice, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. I scrambled toward the stairs, hands outstretched, but the basement felt endless, the walls closing in around me. The whisper turned into a harsh, guttural growl, and I stumbled over something hard on the floor. I hit the ground with a painful thud, scraping my palms against the rough concrete. Panic seized me as I scrambled to find the stairs, but a cold hand closed around my ankle, yanking me back. I let out a strangled cry, twisting and kicking, desperate to break free. The grip was relentless, icy fingers digging into my skin, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I clawed at the air, my nails scraping against something rough wood, maybe? And then the planchette from the Ouija board slid across the floor, stopping just inches from my face. A voice hissed in my ear, low and venomous. "You shouldn't have come back." I screamed, something raw and primal, my voice echoing off the basement walls. Then there was a sudden, violent tug, and I was free, sprawling onto the bottom step. Without looking back, I scrambled up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. Back in the hallway, I leaned against the door, gasping for breath. The house was silent once more, but the weight of those icy fingers lingered on my ankle. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it the board? Some evil trapped in this house? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe here anymore. I headed for the front door, fumbling with the lock, desperate to get outside, to fresh air, to any place that didn't hold shadows like this. But then I stopped cold. On the inside of the door, written in a shaky, dripping script, was a single word: stay. My hands trembled as I wiped at the message, but the letters didn't fade. They seemed to pulse, alive, threatening. I backed away, heart hammering, and turned to find Daniel standing in the living room doorway. His eyes were wide, unfocused, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. "We have to leave," he whispered. "Now!" But neither of us moved. Something in the house was watching us, waiting. The Ouija board had opened a door, and whatever was on the other side wasn't done yet. Outside, the sky twisted in strange colors, the clouds roiling like a storm about to break. The house groaned, walls bending as if breathing. I realized then that this wasn't just a place. It was a trap, and we were its prisoners. When I woke up that morning, the weight of the previous night's events still pressed heavily on me. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak from the old house settling. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that everything had just been some elaborate trick of my imagination, that the Ouija board hadn't actually done anything. But deep down, I knew better. The way the planchette had moved, the strange words it spelled out, it wasn't just a movement of my fingers or a harmless game. Something had been there, something that had touched our world. I had planned to leave immediately, to get out of that house and never look back. But I couldn't. Not yet. There was too much that needed to be figured out, too many unanswered questions. And maybe, I was hoping, if I understood what we'd unleashed, I might find a way to put it back. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. I sat up, the wooden floor cold under my feet as I climbed out of bed. The house was eerily still, and the silence felt like it was waiting for me to break it. I made my way to the living room, where the Ouija board was still lying on the coffee table, its corners catching the light. I hesitated before picking it up, my fingers tracing the worn edges. It looked almost innocent, like any other old game, but I knew better. I took the board over to the kitchen table and sat down, pulling out my phone to check if anyone had messaged me overnight. Nothing. No calls. Just silence. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in my chest, but it was stubborn. It clung to me like a second skin. I thought about the messages we'd gotten last night, how the planchette had spelled out help and then run. At first, I thought it was just a trick, maybe one of us trying to scare the others. But the way it had shifted, the way it had moved on its own, I couldn't explain that. The last thing I wanted was to believe that something malevolent was reaching out to us. But I couldn't deny what I'd seen. My phone buzzed suddenly, jumping in my hand and making me start. A text from an unknown number. Don't trust it. I stared at the message, my heart pounding. Who was this? Had one of the others sent it as a joke? I typed back, asking who it was, but no reply came. Deciding I needed a break from the house, I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, the sun higher in the sky now but still weak through the overcast clouds. The neighborhood seemed normal enough, kids playing down the street, a neighbor mowing his lawn, but I felt like I was walking through a dream. Nothing felt real anymore. I tried to call Sarah, one of the others from the night before, but it went straight to voicemail. Same with Mike and Jenna. It was like everyone had disappeared. Panic started to rise in me. I needed to find them, to make sure they were okay. I decided to walk to the small diner a few blocks away. We'd all been planning to meet there later that day. Maybe if I got there first, I could gather my thoughts and figure out what to do next. The walk felt longer than usual. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound sharper. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing, just my own breath and footsteps. When I got to the diner, it was surprisingly empty. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, but no one looked up. I called out, "Hello," but my voice sounded strange in the quiet room. I checked my phone again. No new messages. I sat down at the counter, ordered a coffee, and tried to calm myself. My mind kept drifting back to the Ouija board, to the messages it had spelled out so clearly. What had we unleashed? And why did it feel like it was still here, watching? The waitress finally appeared, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked at me with tired eyes. "You look like you could use a break," she said quietly. I nodded. "Yeah, it's been a rough night." She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Be careful with those things," she said, glancing toward the door like she was afraid someone might hear. "Some doors shouldn't be opened." I wanted to ask her more, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just nodded and thanked her, sipping the coffee as I tried to make sense of it all. After a while, I realized I couldn't just sit there. I needed to find the others and figure out what had happened. The Ouija board wasn't just a game, it was a gateway. And whatever was on the other side was still reaching for us. I left the diner and started walking back toward the house. The sky had darkened again, heavy clouds rolling in, and a cold wind picked up. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, shaky shadows over the pavement. As I approached the house, I felt a sudden chill. The front door was slightly ajar. I hadn't left it that way. My heart hammered in my chest as I pushed it open fully and stepped inside. The living room was just as I'd left it, except the Ouija board was missing. I scanned the room, panic rising. Then I heard a soft scraping sound coming from the basement stairs. I forced myself to move, descending carefully into the dark. The basement was cold and damp, the only light coming from the flickering bulb overhead. I could barely make out the outline of the board leaning against the far wall, but something else caught my eye, a figure, crouched in the corner, barely visible. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure looked up slowly. It was Mike. His eyes were wide and wild, and his skin was pale. "You shouldn't have come back," he whispered. "It's not done with us." Before I could react, the planchette slid across the floor toward me, stopping at my feet as if waiting. I swallowed hard, realizing that the board wasn't just a piece of wood, it was alive, connected to something far darker than I'd imagined. And now, it was waiting for me. Story 2, Beneath the Silent Depths. I never thought much about fishing before that summer. It had always seemed a slow, quiet kind of pastime, the kind that people took up to relax, to find a little peace away from their busy lives. Me, I was no stranger to the outdoors, but I'd never been the patient type. Still, when my grandfather passed and left me his cabin by the lake, I figured I might as well try it out. The solitude promised by the place was exactly what I needed to clear my head and piece together parts of my own life that felt fractured. The cabin was everything the brochure had boasted: rustic, isolated, perched on the edge of a dense forest with the lake shimmering just beyond the tall pines. It had a worn wooden dock stretching out into the water, old fishing gear in the corner, and a musty smell that reminded me of old books and damp earth. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sun already low, casting long shadows over the water. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and something else I couldn't quite name, something faintly metallic, like iron. I unloaded my bags, set up a small fire in the stone ring outside the cabin, and sat on the dock, watching the surface of the lake ripple with the evening breeze. The water was unnervingly still in some spots, almost mirror-like, save for the occasional glint of a fish breaking the surface. I had the uneasy feeling that something was watching me, though I told myself it was just the loneliness getting to me. The forest stretched thick and silent behind me, no sounds of wildlife, only the soft slap of water against the wooden boards beneath my feet. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of the lake lapping gently against the shore, but I woke before dawn, the darkness outside the cabin as thick as tar. From the window, I noticed a faint glow floating just above the water, too steady to be a firefly or any natural light. Curious and unable to resist, I wrapped a jacket around myself and stepped out onto the dock. The chill in the air bit at my skin, and the night smelled sharper, colder. The glow hovered about 30 feet from the end of the dock, pulsing softly, almost like a heartbeat. As I watched, the light dimmed, then vanished with a suddenness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I blinked, tried to shake off the unease, and headed back inside. It wasn't until I laid down again that I realized the faintest sound had accompanied the light, a low, gurgling whisper coming from the lake. It wasn't quite speech, but it made the hairs on my neck prickle, as if something was trying to call me from beneath the surface. The next morning, I found the old fishing pole leaning against the cabin door, the line knotted and tangled as if something unseen had pulled on it overnight. I spent the day trying to untangle the mess, the uneasiness from the night before simmering at the back of my mind. The lake looked harmless enough in daylight, its surface sparkling under the sun, but I kept catching glimpses of movement just below the water, fleeting shadows darting away whenever I looked too long. On my second night, I decided to fish. I figured if I was going to be here, I might as well try to catch something. The moon was full, casting silver light over the lake that made everything look sharper, more defined. I sat at the end of the dock with the pole in my hands, the line cast far out into the cold water. The quiet was absolute except for the occasional splash, the tick of insects hidden in the trees. Hours passed without a single tug, until suddenly the rod bent sharply, dragging my arms toward the water. I grabbed hold, heart hammering, and began reeling in whatever had taken the bait. The resistance was unlike anything I'd ever felt fishing before, strong, uneven, almost deliberate. It wasn't a simple fish. It felt intelligent, like the thing on the other end was fighting with purpose. Slowly, the shape emerged from the depths, a dark silhouette breaking the surface, and my breath caught cold in my throat. It wasn't a fish at all. At first, I thought it was some kind of floating debris, twisted and covered in algae, but then I saw the glimmer of something smooth and pale beneath the water, a shape too large and too unnatural to belong to any creature I knew. The water around it bubbled, and the thing jerked violently, pulling the line with a force that nearly dragged me off the dock. I lost grip when it lurched forward one last time and the line snapped. The thing slipped beneath the surface, leaving a trail of dark water swirling in its wake. I sat frozen for a long moment, the cold sweat running down my back. The lake was calm again, but the feeling of being watched had returned with a vengeance. The next morning I found strange marks along the shore, shallow impressions, like claws gouged into the mud, leading from the water into the forest. I followed them, heart racing, until they disappeared beneath the thick underbrush. The forest was still and silent, as if waiting, and every snap of a twig echoed like a gunshot. The deeper I went, the denser the shadows became, pressing in around me. Eventually, I stopped, my breath ragged, and turned back toward the cabin, the strange feeling of ice tracking me, never leaving. That day, I avoided the water. I told myself whatever it was had only been curious, or maybe frightened. But that night, when I lay in bed listening to the creak of the old cabin settling, I heard it again, the faint gurgling whisper rising from the lake, closer this time, more urgent. It wasn't a call anymore. It was a warning. I didn't sleep. When dawn broke, I stepped outside and found a single fish lying on the dock. It was unlike any I'd seen, pale and slick, with eyes that seemed to shimmer with a strange inner light. Its mouth hung open as if gasping, but no water dripped from its gills. I wanted to throw it back, but an irrational fear stopped me. I took a picture on my phone, hands trembling, then placed it in a small bucket I'd brought from the cabin. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of unease. I kept glancing toward the water, half expecting to see the dark shape rise again. When I finally returned to the dock that afternoon, the bucket was empty, the fish was gone. No sign of struggle, no footprints, nothing. Just the faintest trail of slime leading toward the lake. I realized then that this wasn't just some isolated incident. Something was in the water, something far older and more patient than I could imagine. And it was watching, waiting for me to make my next move. The morning light seeped weakly through the cracked window of the cabin, casting pale, uneven shadows across the cluttered room. I woke up stiff and cold, the strange chill from the night before still lingering on my skin. My dreams had been restless, filled with dark water and shapes moving just beneath the surface, but nothing solid, nothing I could grasp. I chalked it up to exhaustion and the stress of the previous day, though a nagging unease gnawed at the back of my mind. The lake outside lay utterly still, a dull gray reflecting the heavy sky above. There was no wind, no birdsong, only the faint, occasional drip of water from the sagging eaves. I pulled on my boots and jacket, then stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking beneath my weight. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. I hadn't spoken to anyone since I left town the day before. No one knew where I was or when I might come back. That secrecy felt necessary after what I'd seen, after what I'd almost lost there on the water. The lake had a way of swallowing things whole, and I was sure it had nearly swallowed me. I moved carefully down the narrow dirt path to the rickety dock where my small fishing boat was tied. The rope was loose, the knot frayed, but nothing was missing. I ran a hand along the oar, rough and splintered, and peered into the water. It was murky and brownish near the shore, but darker farther out, like ink spilling into a pool of muddy water. The previous day's catch had been small, but the moment I'd felt the tug on the line, a deep, cold dread had gripped me. I hadn't just seen the fish. Something else had been there, lurking beneath the surface, something that didn't belong. The way the water had moved when I pulled in that catch, it wasn't natural. Like the lake was alive and watching. I shoved all thoughts aside and pushed off from the dock. The boat rocked gently as I settled in, the familiar clink of gear and tackle barely comforting. The engine sputtered at first but caught quickly. I steered toward the deeper part of the lake where the fish were supposed to be abundant. The sky was thick with gray clouds, and the cold seeped in through my jacket. The water was eerily calm. No ripples, no breeze, just an oppressive stillness that made every splash from the motor sound deafening. I set down the trolling line and sat back, hoping for a normal day. My eyes scanned the horizon, restless. Time passed slowly, the minutes stretching out like the endless ripples I disturbed. Every now and then, the line jerked sharply, pulling taut. I'd reel in steadily, expecting a fish, but each time something smaller, weaker caught at the hook, a tiny perch, a minnow, a tangle of weeds. Nothing like the monster I'd felt the day before. Then, without warning, the boat lurched violently to one side. The motor died instantly, the water around me splashing like a sudden storm. My heart pounded hard. I grabbed the sides, trying to steady myself. The line was taut in a way no fish could manage, heavy, jerking with a slow, deliberate force. The water beneath the boat rippled outward in concentric circles, dark and murky. I pulled at the rod, muscles straining. Whatever was on the other end wasn't fighting like a fish. It was fighting with an intelligence, a steady, unyielding strength that refused to break. It dragged the boat in a slow, agonizing circle, the current pulling against the engine. I tried to restart it, but it sputtered helplessly. The sky seemed to darken as I wrestled with the line. My breath came in ragged gasps. The water was suddenly too close, threatening to swallow me whole. I saw something beneath the surface, a shadow, larger than anything I'd imagined. It moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic, its shape shifting beneath the murk. I knew then that I was not dealing with a fish. Panic rose like a tide within me. The boat rocked harder as the creature pulled again, this time toward the depths. I grabbed the oar and struck the water randomly, desperate to fend off the unseen terror. The water exploded where I hit, sending cold spray over my face. Then the line went slack. I stared down at the empty water, heart pounding in my ears. The lake was calm again, silent, empty. The boat drifted slowly, untethered. I grabbed the oar and began to row back toward shore, the muscles in my arms burning with effort. The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang. I looked down at my hands, something dark and sticky clung to my fingers. I wiped it off on my jacket, but the smell stayed with me, sharp and bitter. Blood. Or something like it. When I reached the dock, I pulled the boat in quickly and climbed out, my legs trembling. I looked back at the water, half expecting to see the shadow waiting for me, but the lake was still, indifferent. Inside the cabin, I poured a stiff drink and sat at the table, hands shaking. The fear that had driven me to this isolated place was no longer just fear of loneliness or failure. It was something far worse, the knowledge that something in the water was watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been marked, that the lake had claimed me in some way. And if I stayed, it would come back. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. There was something I needed to understand, something I needed to find before this thing dragged me under completely. I stared out the window at the gray expanse of water. The day was dying, the sky bleeding into dusk. Somewhere out there, beneath the surface, something stirred. And it was hungry. I woke before dawn, the chill seeping through the thin walls of the cabin. Outside, the lake was a dark stretch of ink, silent except for the occasional plop of water hitting the shore. The mist hovered low, swirling in slow ghostly tendrils that made the treeline look like a gathering of watchful eyes. I sat up on the narrow cot, rubbing the stiffness from my neck, the memory of yesterday's strange catch crawling back into my mind. The fish, if it could be called that, still haunted me. Not just because of the way it looked, with its bloated, translucent skin and the eyes that didn't reflect light but seemed absurdly dull, like they belonged to a creature dead before it ever saw the water. It was how it felt in my hands, almost heavy with something I couldn't name. It was like holding a secret that didn't want to be uncovered. I dressed quickly, pulling on the worn jacket I'd left by the door, and stepped outside. The cold air bit at my cheeks, and the lake's surface was a mirror reflecting the pale, fading stars. I headed toward the dock, the wooden planks slick with dew. The boat was still tied up tight, rocking gently as if waiting for me. I needed to check the traps again. The previous day had been strange enough, but the more I thought about that malformed fish, the more I felt a pull, a gnawing urge to understand what it was, where it had come from. I shook off the irrational thoughts. I'd been fishing these waters for years without incident. Maybe I was just tired, letting my imagination run wild. The traps were set near the northern bend of the lake, where the water deepened and the shadows seemed to lengthen even under daylight. I untied the boat and pushed off, the oars cutting through the quiet water with soft splashes. The mist clung to my shoulders, and the only sound was the creaking of the oarlocks and the occasional distant call of a loon. When I reached the first trap, I pulled it up slowly, the metal frame groaning in protest. Inside, a few common perch flailed weakly, but something else caught my eye, a dark shape tangled in the netting below them. I reached down, and my fingers brushed against something slick and cold. I pulled it up, and my breath caught. It wasn't a fish. At least, it wasn't any fish I'd ever seen. Its body was twisted and elongated, covered in slimy, translucent skin that shimmered with unnatural hues. The eyes were sunken but still stared back, and the mouth was a gaping slit filled with rows of tiny sharp teeth. I dropped the trap, my heart hammering, and the thing slipped back into the water with a splash that seemed far too loud. I sat back, the oars resting against the sides of the boat, my mind racing. What the hell was that? The lake had always been full of surprises, but nothing like this. I tried to rationalize it, some kind of rare deep-water fish, displaced by recent storms or temperature shifts. Maybe a mutated creature, the product of some environmental anomaly. But the thought didn't settle. It felt wrong, like the lake was hiding something beneath its surface, something old and angry. I knew I shouldn't keep going, not after what I'd seen, but the pull was too strong. Fishing wasn't just a pastime for me, it was a way to connect with the land, to find calm in the unpredictable. And yet, the peacefulness had been shattered. The water no longer looked inviting, it felt like a dark mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I checked the second trap, my hands trembling slightly. It was empty. No fish, no strange shapes. Just the dull, cold water beneath me, stretching into the gray dawn. I sat there for a long moment, the fog thickening around the boat, swallowing the shoreline from view. The boundary between water and land vanished, and I was adrift in a sea of uncertainty. Suddenly, a faint splash echoed somewhere to my left, the sharp, distinct sound of something large surfacing briefly. I spun toward it, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The mist drew tight, like a curtain cutting me off from the rest of the world. I gripped the oars harder, the wood rough and grounding beneath my palms. I decided it was time to head back. The morning light was coming, but the unease wouldn't lift. As I rowed back, I thought about the stories the locals told, rumors of strange creatures stirring beneath the lake, old fishing villages abandoned after sudden disappearances, whispered warnings passed down like a shroud. I'd always dismissed them as superstition, but standing on that water, alone and exposed, I wasn't so sure. Back at the cabin, I hung the wick gear to dry and lit a fire in the stone hearth. The warmth felt good, but it did little to thaw the knot in my stomach. I sat by the window, staring out at the lake that now looked like a dark abyss, something waiting, watching. That night, Sleep came in fitful bursts, haunted by dreams of writhing shapes beneath the surface, the water boiling and black eyes opening wide. I woke once to a strange scratching at the cabin door, but when I pulled back the curtain, nothing was there. I told myself it was the wind or a wandering animal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake's secrets were closing in, that the water was not just a place where fish swam, but a doorway to something far darker. By morning, I knew I would go back. I had to know what lurked beneath that mirror surface, even if it meant facing the nightmare waiting in the depths. The morning fog clung to the lake like a shroud as I climbed back into the boat, the chill in the air heavier than it had been the day before. The sun was a pale promise behind thick clouds, barely managing to pierce the mist that hovered over the water's surface. My hands trembled slightly as I packed the gear, every creak of the wooden planks beneath my boots echoing too loudly in the eerie silence. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the lake was just a lake, that the strange things I'd seen and heard were products of exhaustion and imagination. But the unease that had settled in my gut after yesterday's encounter refused to dissipate. The memory of that sudden tug on the line, the unnatural force, too strong for any fish I'd ever caught, played on a loop in my mind. And then there was the shape I glimpsed beneath the water. Not a fish, no, something too large, too deliberate, watching me. The water around the boat had darkened unnaturally where it had disappeared, as though it swallowed light. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the murky depths, or maybe the angle of the sun, but that explanation felt hollow. I pushed off from the shore, the oars cutting through the still water with a muted splash. The lake was vast, with many hidden coves and thick stands of reeds along the shoreline. Today, I aimed for a spot farther out, where I hoped I could find the kind of catch that would justify the trip and erase the growing gnawing fear. If I could just catch something, anything, then I could leave this place behind. The boat drifted slowly, rocking gently with the subtle waves, the quiet punctuated only by the soft creak of the wood and the occasional call of a faraway bird. I cast my line again, the lure plopping into the water with a splash that sounded louder than it should have. There was a peacefulness here, but under it, the feeling of being watched persisted, like eyes lurking just beneath the surface. I tried not to look too long into the murky depths, but the water's surface shimmered oddly, distorting the reflections, as if hiding something. Hours passed with only the occasional nibble, nothing to steady my nerves or my empty stomach. The cold was settling into my bones now, and I wrapped my jacket tighter, cursing myself for coming back. But then the line jerked violently, a sharp tug that nearly yanked the rod from my grasp. My heart leapt, adrenaline flooding through me as I braced myself. I pulled hard, struggling against the weight on the other end. This was no ordinary fish. The line strained, the reel winding as the creature fought deep below. I could feel the power, something alive and malevolent tugging with an intelligence that chilled me. Slowly, painfully, I reeled it in, the water bubbling and churning as the shape broke the surface. It was enormous, but not like any fish I'd seen before. Its skin was slick and mottled, a patchwork of bruised purples and sickly greens. The eyes were the worst part, too large, unblinking, staring straight at me with an intelligence that felt almost human. Its mouth was a grotesque gape, filled with rows of jagged teeth that glinted faintly in the dim light. The creature flailed, thrashing the boat dangerously, water sloshing over the sides. I fought to keep control, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away. I couldn't let this thing pull me under. But then the creature's tail lashed out, smashing into the side of the boat. The wood cracked ominously, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to capsize. The beast gave one final, desperate thrash and then went limp. I stared down at it, panting, the reality of what I'd caught settling over me like a cold weight. This thing was not from any normal lake ecosystem. It was something ancient, something wrong. I had to get it ashore, had to show someone, anyone, that I wasn't crazy, that what I'd seen was real. With trembling hands, I managed to haul the creature into the boat. Its slick body slid against the wood, cold and slimy, a nauseating smell rising from it, a mixture of decay and something metallic. I gagged, but kept my grip. The lake around me seemed to hold its breath. The trip back was a nightmare. Every splash of the oars sounded like a threat, every shadow in the fog a lurking predator. The creature's eyes never left me, and I swear I saw its mouth twitch in a semblance of a smile, a terrible grin that promised more horrors to come. When I finally reached the dock, my legs were jelly, the boat scraping against the wood with a harsh grind. I pulled the creature out and laid it on the shore, the smell making me retch again. I wanted to run, to escape this cursed lake and the nightmare it harbored, but I couldn't. I had to document what I'd found. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking violently, and took pictures. The images were ghastly, too unreal to believe. I sent them to a few friends with a quick note, "Something's wrong here. Please, just look." I didn't expect much. Who would believe me? But I needed someone to know. As I packed up, something shifted in the water behind me, a ripple, a shadow. I turned sharply, heart in my throat, but saw nothing. Just the fog rolling in thicker now, swallowing the lake whole. I hurried away, the creature's terrible eyes still burned into my mind. Whatever had pulled on my line, whatever lived beneath the surface, it wasn't done yet. I knew that much with bone-deep certainty. That night, lying in bed with the windows shut tight, I kept hearing it, that faint splash, the scraping of something heavy against wood. And outside, beyond the safety of my walls, the lake waited, dark and patient, ready to pull me back into its depths. The night swallowed the lake whole, its surface a flat, glassy mirror reflecting a sky ashamed of its own darkness. I sat alone in the boat, the wooden hull creaking softly as the water lapped against its sides, each tiny slap a reminder that the stillness was never truly still. The heavy scent of moss and damp earth clung to my jacket, mingling with the faint smell of fish slime that seemed to have ingrained itself into every part of me since I'd started this cursed trip. I tried to remember how I had ended up here, drifting further from shore, the sun long swallowed by the horizon. At some point, I had stopped keeping track of time. The biting cold had seeped into my bones, but I couldn't bring myself to row back. There was something, some invisible tether, pulling me out, deeper into the heart of the lake. I told myself it was curiosity, or maybe stubbornness. The truth was far darker. Earlier that afternoon, when daylight still held dominion, I'd found the old fishing rod lying half buried in the mud near the dock, a relic from some forgotten angler. It was ancient, the wood cracked and worn, the line frayed as if it had battled storms and tides for 100 years. I should have left it alone, but something about it beckoned me. As soon as I gripped the rod, the hairs on my neck stood on end, and an unsettling shiver ran down my spine. I told myself it was just a chill, a natural reaction to the eerie quiet of the lake. But I knew better. There had been no fish all day. Not a single tug on the line, no ripple breaking the surface except for the occasional darting of minnows near the shore. And yet, I'd felt watched. Every time I glanced into the depths, shadows twisted just beneath the surface, shifting and writhing like the lake breathed with a life of its own. I imagined eyes staring back at me, cold and unblinking. Now, under the cloak of night, the water seemed to churn with a hidden menace. I pulled the rod from its resting place, holding it tightly as if it were a lifeline. The line hung loose, barely touching the water, but I refused to reel it in. Something was down there, waiting. Suddenly, the line jerked violently, and I nearly fell over backwards. My heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped animal. I gripped the rod with both hands, knuckles white, and began to reel. The pull was strong, unnatural. Whoever or whatever was on the other end fought with a strength that defied any fish I'd ever caught. The rod bowed violently as I struggled to keep control. I whispered to myself, telling myself it was a monster catfish or a snagged log, anything but the nightmare my mind conjured in the suffocating silence. The line tugged again, relentless, and I fought to keep my grip, the rope of tension biting into my palms. The boat rocked dangerously, the thin wood groaning under the strain. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the tug stopped. The line went slack. I held my breath, waiting, expecting the struggle to resume, but there was only silence. The weight on the other end of the line remained, heavy and unmoving. Slowly, I began to reel it in, every rotation of the handle pulling me closer to the unknown. When the object broke the surface, I froze. Floating just beneath the water was a large bundle wrapped in seaweed and sopping moss. It looked like a net, perhaps something cast by a desperate fisherman, but as I pulled it closer, the shape shifted. A dull, what thud against the side of the boat confirmed it was solid. I lifted the bundle over the edge, my limbs trembling. Unwrapping it, I found a pale, swollen hand, fingers gnarled and twisted, skin mottled and peeling like a corpse's. The nails were long, dirt-encrusted, and the faintest pulse throbbed beneath the icy flesh. My stomach churned violently, bile rising in my throat. A sudden splash startled me. I whipped around, heart leaping, but saw only the endless black water, disturbed by fading ripples. The hand twitched. I slammed it back into the boat, backing away. It twitched again, fingers curling. Panic clawed at my chest as the rest of the body emerged, first an arm, then a grotesquely swollen torso, waterlogged and pale, eyes wide open, lifeless yet somehow aware. The thing was a drowned man, or something that once had been human. It leaked water and mud like a broken vessel, strands of kelp clinging to its shredded clothes. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped. The creature's mouth opened, revealing crooked, stained teeth. It gurgled a sound like death itself bubbling up from the depths. The boat jerked violently, pitching forward. I scrambled to regain balance, heart hammering in my throat. The creature's hand reached for me, slow but inexorable, dragging itself toward the edge. I shoved hard, and it toppled back into the lake with a heavy splash. The water around me erupted in a frenzy of movement, dark shapes swirling just below the surface. My breath hitched as dozens of pale hands broke the water, grasping upward like drowned branches reaching for air. The lake was alive with them, the dead clawing their way out of their watery graves. I grabbed the oars, desperate to escape. The boat groaned under the sudden strain as I rowed with all my might, arms burning, lungs screaming for air. Behind me, the lake roiled with unnatural fury, the water boiling with the restless dead. The hands slipped beneath the surface, but the sense of their presence lingered, a suffocating weight pressing down on me. The shore was a distant smear of shadow, but the lake seemed to stretch infinitely, a black maw refusing to release its prey. Each stroke forward was a battle against despair, the night closing in until the only thing I could see was the small circle of light cast by my dying flashlight. I didn't look back again. Story 3: Silent Shores of the Forgotten Resort. The bus ride had been longer than I expected. Sitting by the window, I watched the sun dip behind jagged mountains, their peaks swallowed by a creeping dusk that stretched the shadows across the valley below. The air inside the bus was stale, a mix of recycled breath and the faint, greasy odor of last night's snack wrappers. I gripped my backpack tighter, though there was nothing inside worth protecting except a few clothes, my phone, and a paperback novel I hadn't opened since the first hour of the journey. The countryside outside was a blur of darkening fields and skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate fingers. I had come here for a vacation and escape from the city's relentless noise and the crushing demands of work. The village was supposed to be quiet, picturesque, a place to recharge. Instead, it felt like stepping back into a time long before me, far away from the modern world. According to the brochure, the village had fewer than 200 residents, tucked between dense forests and rolling hills. No internet, limited cell service, and a handful of old stone cottages lined up like forgotten relics along a narrow road that twisted through the valley. The driver announced our stop with a gruff voice, jarring me from my thoughts. We had reached the last station before the village. I slung my bag over my shoulder and stepped off the bus onto the cracked pavement of a tiny platform. The evening air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine needles. Silence pressed in immediately, the kind that hangs heavily in the quiet spaces between sounds. I glanced around. The station was deserted except for a single figure standing under the flickering street lamp at the far end. He wore a thick coat, despite the mild temperature, and his head was bowed as if lost in thought or waiting. There was something about him that set my nerves on edge, though I couldn't say what. I quickened my pace toward the village, deciding not to linger. The road ahead was barely more than a narrow lane, flanked by fields that gave way to the forest's edge. As I walked, the last light faded completely, and the stars began to prick the sky. The moon was a thin crescent, too dim to illuminate much beyond the immediate path. My footsteps echoed softly against the gravel, the only sound apart from the occasional rustle of leaves and distant calls of nocturnal creatures. After about 15 minutes, the scattered cottages came into view. Their windows glowed warmly, small islands of light in the surrounding darkness. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, promising wood fires and simple dinners. Despite the inviting scene, a chill ran down my spine. The village felt suspended in time, untouched by the hurried world I'd left behind. It was as if the residents had no reason to look beyond their little valley, no desire to reach out or change. I found the 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐫𝐞, a squat stone building with a faded sign hanging crookedly above the door. The name was hard to read, worn by years of weather. Inside, the common room was modest but cozy, lit by a fireplace whose flames danced and cast flickering shadows on the rough wooden walls. Behind the counter stood an older woman with a stern face and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound friendly. "I have a reservation under Miller." She looked me up and down as if weighing my presence there. After a moment, she nodded curtly and handed me a tarnished brass key. "Room 3. Dinner's at 7. Don't be late." Her tone left no room for questions. I followed a narrow corridor upstairs to a small room with a single bed, a rickety dresser, and a window overlooking the village square. The air was heavy, musty with the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic that I couldn't identify. I set down my bag and pulled back the curtains. The village lay quiet beneath the moonlight, bathed in silvery shadows. Curiosity gnawed at me. I needed something to eat, but the inn's dinner hour was still an hour away. I decided to explore the village a little, hoping to stretch my legs after the long journey. I locked my door behind me and stepped onto the cold wooden stairs. Outside, the night had deepened. The streets were empty, save for the silhouette of the man I'd seen at the station, now standing near a well in the village square. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. In fact, he didn't even turn. His posture was stiff, unmoving, like a statue carved from shadow. Unease settled further into my gut. Something wasn't right here. I wandered toward the cluster of cottages, their windows dark except for one, the small house near the edge of the village that had a faint orange glow from a single candle. I approached slowly, the wooden boards of the porch creaking underfoot. The door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, debating whether to peek inside, but a sudden cold breeze pushed me forward. Inside, the room was sparse: an old table, a cracked mirror hanging crooked on the wall, and a rocking chair that moved gently, as if stirred by an unseen hand. I stared at it, heart pounding. Surely the wind couldn't reach this far inside. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, like breath against skin. I spun around, but no one was there. The candle flickered wildly, casting grotesque shapes that writhed along the walls. I backed out slowly, the whispering rising into a low murmur that seemed to call my name, indistinct but insistent. I ran back to the inn, the shadows seeming to reach for me from every corner. When I slammed the door behind me, the silence inside was suffocating. I leaned against it, breathing heavily, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But just before I turned on the light, I caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. The man from the station was standing beneath the street lamp again, but this time, he was staring directly at me. His eyes shone with an unnatural brightness, and his mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I didn't sleep that night. The shadows in the corners of my room seemed deeper, almost alive. Every creak and whisper outside my window felt like a warning. The village was not the peaceful retreat I had hoped for. It was something else, something waiting. And I was already caught in its grip. The cold had seeped into my bones by the time I finally reached the little town. I had no idea what I'd been expecting, but the streets were almost empty, and the few people I passed gave me nothing but wary glances. The kind of looks that made you feel like you'd wandered into a place where you didn't belong. My breath came out in ragged clouds as I pulled my coat tighter and pressed on toward the inn I booked weeks ago, hoping at least for a warm room. The sign outside the building was faded and creaked with the wind, swinging loose on its hinges. I stepped inside, and the sudden warmth hit me like a wave. The air smelled faintly of old wood and smoky fire, and the dim light made the place feel half forgotten, like it hadn't seen many travelers this year. Behind the counter, a woman looked up. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her eyes were sharp, almost too sharp, but she gave a polite nod. "Room for the night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded slowly. "We have one left. Second floor, end of the hall." As she handed me the key, I noticed how her fingers trembled just a little. I wondered what stories this place held, but didn't press. Instead, I paid and headed upstairs, the wooden boards creaking beneath my boots. My room was small, the window fogged and barely letting in the dusk light. I set my bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, running my hands over the threadbare quilt. I wanted to tell myself I was just tired, maybe a little jumpy, but something niggled at the back of my neck, an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. I tried to block it out by unpacking the essentials and planning my route for the next day. The town had a reputation for being quiet in winter, but I'd hoped for enough charm to make the visit worthwhile. Instead, every shadow seemed to linger a little too long, and the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Just as I was about to lie down, a faint noise caught my attention, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming on glass. I froze, listening. It stopped as abruptly as it started. I crossed the room and pulled aside the curtain, but the street below was deserted, slick with ice and gleaming under the street lamp. I closed the curtain and sank back onto the bed, heart still pounding. Maybe it was just the wind, or my imagination. I told myself that over and over as I tried to fall asleep. But then the tapping started again, louder this time, coming from the window nearest the bed. I swung my legs over the side and stood, squinting into the dark. A figure stood just outside, face obscured by shadow. I scrambled back, heart hammering. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise, footsteps in the hallway, the faint creak of floorboards made me tense. The inn felt colder, stranger, like the walls were holding their breath. At dawn, I packed my bag, deciding to leave as soon as the first light spilled over the hills. Downstairs, the woman behind the counter was already there, staring out the window. When I mentioned the figure at my window, her face tightened, but she said nothing. I left without breakfast, the chill biting harder as I stepped outside. The town felt different in the pale morning light, still quiet, but less threatening. Still, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me that never showed themselves. I reached the edge of town and paused, glancing back. The inn stood silent, windows like dark, watching eyes. I shook the feeling off and started walking. The path ahead wound through the woods, and the snow crunched beneath my boots. As I walked, an oppressive silence settled over the forest, broken only by my breath and footsteps. I tried to focus on the promise of warmth and civilization at my journey's end, but the weight of the place pressed down on me. Midway through the woods, the trail narrowed, and the trees seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the gray sky. The wind picked up, carrying a faint whisper that I couldn't quite catch. I stopped and listened. Nothing but silence. A trick of the wind. I kept moving, faster now, eager to reach the highway. Suddenly, through the trees, I saw a figure standing beside the trail ahead. At first, I thought it was a hiker, but the way they stood motionless, head tilted slightly, felt wrong. The person wore an old coat, worn and patched, eyes fixed on me. I called out, but the figure didn't respond or move. My heart sank. There was no one else for miles, and the sun was sinking fast. I turned to leave, but then heard a soft, raspy voice whisper my name. I froze. The voice was unmistakably human, but there was something hollow beneath it, like an echo from far away. I spun around, but the woods behind me were empty. I broke into a run, the snow slipping underfoot, branches scratching my face. Behind me, I thought I heard footsteps, but whenever I dared to glance back, there was nothing there. When I finally burst onto the edge of the highway, the sound ceased abruptly. The roar of distant cars was like a bomb, grounding me back to reality. I didn't stop running until I reached the first gas station, its neon sign flickering weakly in the dusk. Inside, the clerk looked up from his newspaper, eyes tired but kind. I told him my story, half expecting skepticism, but he only nodded slowly. Some folks don't like the woods this time of year, he said. You're lucky you made it out. I paid for a hot coffee and sat, hands shaking, trying to steady my breath. The warmth seeped through me, but the unease lingered, like a shadow stretching just beyond the edge of the light. I knew the holiday was far from over, and the road ahead held more than just miles. Whatever haunted the town and those woods had followed me this far, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could outrun it. The air inside the cabin was stale, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. The small electric heater sputtered weakly on the floor, its pale orange glow casting elongated shadows across the peeling wallpaper. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, despite the warmth, and scanned the room again, hoping to find some clue about who had lived here or who might still be here. Outside, the wind howled against the single-pane windows, shaking the glass with relentless force. It had started early that morning, a gust that grew into a full-blown storm. The weather report on my phone had warned of heavy rain and strong winds, but no one had mentioned this kind of fury. The reception was spotty at best. I'd been unable to call for help since the moment I arrived. I sat back on the threadbare couch, trying to steady my breath. The room was silent except for the wind and the occasional creak from the old structure. I kept hearing noises, scratches, soft thumps, footsteps that seemed to come from the walls, the attic, the floorboards. Every time I turned my head, nothing was there. Just the cabin and the storm. I tried to make sense of the journal I'd found underneath the loose floorboard in the bedroom. The handwriting was hurried, sometimes illegible, but the entries were unsettling. The author wrote about strange visitors in the night, strange noises outside, and a growing sense of being watched. The last dated page was nearly a year old. It ended abruptly, mid-sentence. The more I read, the more I felt a chill settle deep in my chest. The cabin had been abandoned for years, or so I thought, but the journal suggested otherwise. Someone had been here recently, or maybe was still here. I glanced toward the door. The lock was old and rusted, but it was latched from the outside. I tried to pull it open, but it didn't budge. Panic flickered behind my eyes. Why would it be locked from the outside? Had I been trapped here? The thought made my skin crawl. I paced the room, trying to suppress the rising dread. I needed to find a way out, to get help, or at least figure out what was going on. The storm was probably keeping anyone from passing by, but I had to try. I moved toward the windows. They were grimy and fogged, but I could make out the relentless downpour and the dense forest beyond. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass, peering out for any sign of movement. A flash of lightning illuminated the trees, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It vanished almost immediately into the shadows. My heart quickened. I told myself it was my imagination, the nerves playing tricks on me. Still, the image stuck with me. I decided to check the attic. The creaky stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed, flashlight in hand. The space was cramped and dusty, filled with old boxes and cobwebs. Something there felt wrong, an oppressive silence, heavier than the rest of the house. I swept the light across the room and stopped. Scratches marred the wooden floor, deep and jagged, as if something had clawed at it. Near the corner, I spotted what looked like footprints, but too irregular to be human. The shape was elongated, the toes splayed wide. A sudden banging from below startled me, echoing through the floorboards. I froze, listening. The noise repeated, a heavy thud, slow and deliberate. I couldn't tell if it was inside the cabin or outside in the storm. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The heater went silent. I was plunged into darkness. The only sound was my ragged breathing in the pounding storm. I fumbled for my phone, but the battery was almost dead, the screen barely flickering. The emergency flashlight app came on, casting a dim, shaky beam across the cluttered attic. I swung it toward the hatch, half expecting something to spring out. Nothing. I climbed down the stairs carefully, the floorboards creaking beneath me. In the living room, I noticed something new, a message scrawled in the condensation on the window. I wiped it with my sleeve. The words were smeared but readable. Don't trust the storm. Cold dread seeped into my bones. Who had written that? When? And why? The banging resumed, this time louder and more insistent. It came from the back door. I moved toward it, heart pounding. I peered through the frosted glass. No one was there. No footprints in the muddy ground, just the swirling rain and the trees bending under the howling wind. Then, a whispered voice, barely audible over the storm, seemed to drift through the door cracks. It sounded like my name. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. My pulse thundered in my ears. I forced myself to look again. The voice came again, this time clearer and more urgent. Help me. I told myself it was the wind or a trick of the storm, but no. I knew what I'd heard. I needed to get out. Now. I grabbed my coat and keys, ready to force the door. The lock rattled as I twisted the handle, but it held firm. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on. In the corner of the room, standing just inside the shadows, was a figure. Tall, thin, and shrouded in dripping wet clothes. The face was obscured by a hood, but the eyes gleamed cold, unblinking. I froze. The figure took a step forward. The floor creaked beneath them, the air grew colder. You shouldn't have come, the voice said, low and hollow. I backed away, heart racing, struggling to find words. The figure moved closer, slow and deliberate. I darted toward the side window, throwing myself at it. The glass shattered under my weight, shards cutting into me, but I didn't care. I tumbled outside into the rain-soaked earth. The cold hit me like a wall, but the freedom was immediate. I scrambled to my feet, not daring to look back. Behind me, the cabin loomed, dark and silent once more. The storm swallowed my footsteps as I ran blindly into the forest, the whispered cries chasing me through the trees. I didn't stop until the first faint glow of dawn broke the horizon, and even then, I wasn't sure if I had escaped the cabin or if it had let me go. The night air was colder than I expected as I stepped outside the small motel room. The moon wasn't visible, swallowed by thick clouds that pressed low against the horizon. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest ever since I'd shut the door behind me. The hallway smelled stale, a mix of damp carpet and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. Maybe I was tired, or maybe the incessant knocking from the room next door had started to get to me. It had been going on for hours, 3 sharp knocks, pause, 3 more. Neither the motel manager nor the local sheriff had seemed concerned when I mentioned it, which only made it worse. I decided to walk, to clear my head and make sense of the strangest day I'd had in years. I'd come to this tiny coastal town to escape the usual holiday crowds, to find a quiet spot where the ocean could drown out the constant hum of the city in my mind. Instead, I had found a place that felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Or maybe it was just waiting for me. The streetlights flickered intermittently as I made my way down the cracked sidewalks. Most of the shops were shuttered for the season, their windows dark and uninviting. A few cars were parked haphazardly along the street, their owners probably long gone from this sleepy town. I noticed a faint glow coming from the boardwalk near the water, a cluster of lanterns hanging from the railings, their light blurred by the sea mist rolling in. I headed that way, hoping for the comfort of the ocean's rhythm. As I reached the edge of the pier, I stopped to lean against the railing. The wind was sharper here, biting at my cheeks and tugging at my hair. The ocean itself seemed alive, waves crashing rhythmically against the pilings, the spray cold and salty in the air. At first, it was peaceful, almost hypnotic, but then I caught something else, a distant sound, muffled but distinct. It was a voice, or maybe 2 voices, whispering just beyond the reach of the fog. It was impossible to tell what they were saying, but the tone was urgent, anxious. I turned, searching for the source of the voices. The boardwalk stretched empty in either direction, save for a lone figure standing near the far end, half hidden in the shadows. The shape was too vague to see clearly, but something about the way it stood, motionless and still, sent a jolt of cold fear through me. I called out, but my voice was weak, swallowed by the wind. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. The knocking started again, louder now, echoing from my motel room, relentless and insistent. I ripped my eyes from the shadowy figure and started back toward the street. My pace quickened, heart hammering. When I turned the corner, the street was suddenly flooded with an unearthly light. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes. The old lighthouse at the edge of the town had come alive, its beams slicing through the darkness with unnatural intensity. It rotated slowly, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to stretch and contract like living things. The figure was gone from the boardwalk. I ran the rest of the way to the motel, the knocking now a frantic barrage. The door was locked, but when I tried the knob, it turned easily. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the dim hallway suddenly oppressive and thick with silence. I glanced at the door of the room next to mine. It was slightly ajar, swaying gently as if it had been moved by a breeze. But the air was still. I edged closer and peeked inside. The room was empty. No sign of anyone. The bed was neatly made, the desk clear except for a small, folded piece of paper resting on top. I grabbed it, hands trembling, and unfolded it carefully. The words were scrawled in hurried, uneven handwriting. Don't trust the light. It's watching. A chill slid down my spine. I looked around the room again. Near the window, the curtains fluttered despite the stillness in the air. The window was shut tight. I moved toward it, frowning. Then I noticed something else, scratches on the wooden frame, deep and fresh, as if someone had tried to claw their way inside or out. The knocking stopped. I waited, breath held, but all I heard was the steady pulse of the lighthouse beam outside, its light washing over the thin walls of the motel, relentless and cold. The quiet pressed in on me, suffocating. Suddenly, the power cut out. The hallway plunged into darkness. A low hum began, rising rapidly into a piercing whistle that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I fumbled for my phone, the screen lighting up with a weak glow that barely penetrated the dark. Then, just as abruptly as it started, the noise stopped. The lights flickered back on. I was alone. Or at least, I thought I was. A shadow shifted at the far end of the hallway, a tall, slender figure standing perfectly still beneath the flickering fluorescent bulb. I squinted, heart pounding, but when I blinked it was gone. I backed into my room and locked the door behind me, the weight of that cryptic note heavy in my pocket. I sat on the bed, staring at the door, trying to convince myself that the entire town was just a trick of my imagination. That there was no figure on the boardwalk, no scratching at the window, no knocking that echoed through the night. But sleep wouldn't come. Outside, the lighthouse continued its relentless sweep, casting long, searching beams through the fog, as if trying to find me or something far worse. The bus came to a stop with a jerk. I blinked against the sudden jolt, my head lolling forward as I gripped the metal pole in front of my seat. The driver opened the door, and a cold rush of wind swept inside, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The small station was deserted, save for a flickering street lamp struggling against the thickening fog. I checked my phone, no signal. Of course. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, signals were as scarce as kindness. I had taken this route hoping to reach the village before dark, to find that little bed and breakfast I'd read about online. A place with good reviews, rustic charm, and most importantly, a roof over my head. But something about the stillness nodded me as I stepped off the bus. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the gravel and the distant, intermittent croaks of frogs hidden somewhere in the wet underbrush. "Excuse me," I called out, looking around. "Is there a place to stay nearby?" No answer. The bus driver had already retreated inside his booth, slamming the door behind him. The windows were fogged over, so I couldn't see if he was watching me. My gut twisted into a knot. I'd been alone for hours now, after the last passenger had gotten off. That was the problem with traveling during the off-season, there was no one around. I swallowed hard, pushing my backpack higher on my shoulders. The directions on my phone's offline map showed a path leading into the woods toward the village. It was only 2 miles away, but I could feel the pull of the shadows gathering between the trees, the way the fog clung like a shroud. Still, I couldn't wait here, and I sure as hell wasn't getting back on that bus. I started walking, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the murk. The path was narrow, flanked by dense thickets that seemed to lean in as I passed, their skeletal branches scratching at the wind. The scent of rot was stronger here, mingling with damp pine and something else, something metallic and sharp. After 10 minutes, I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps behind me. I stopped abruptly, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I spun around, flashlight swinging wildly, but the fog swallowed the beam. Nothing. Just silence, save for the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was probably a deer or some animal rustling through the undergrowth. But when the footsteps quickened too, matching mine step for step, a cold dread settled in my chest. The path curved sharply, opening onto a small clearing. The moon peeked through the clouds, casting pale light on a derelict stone cottage that looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. Its windows were boarded up, the door hanging crooked on rusty hinges. I considered turning back, but the steps behind me grew louder, more urgent. I edged toward the cottage, hoping for shelter or at least a place to hide. Then I heard a voice, low, hoarse, barely a whisper, calling my name. I froze. The voice was familiar, but distorted as if filtered through a nightmare. Jessica. It breathed. My heart hammered against my ribs. I didn't have anyone who knew I'd come here. I hadn't told anyone. Who could possibly know my name? The footsteps stopped, replaced by silence so thick it was suffocating. Summoning whatever courage I had left, I shoved the door open. The hinges groaned like a dying animal. Inside, the air was stale and cold. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam revealing broken furniture draped in cobwebs and dust motes dancing in the air. I hurried in, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the door, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The voice came again, closer this time. Jessica. I scanned the room, desperate for a hiding place or an escape. My eyes landed on a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated. Going down into a cellar seemed reckless, but the alternative was standing still, waiting for whoever or whatever was out there. I crept down the steps, each one creaking under my weight. The cold seeped through the cracked stone walls, wrapping around me like icy fingers. At the bottom, the cellar stretched out, filled with old crates and empty bottles. A faint, bluish light flickered from an old lantern hanging near the far wall. I moved toward it, heart pounding. The voice was gone now, replaced by the distant sound of dripping water. Then, suddenly, a shadow shifted at the edge of the light. I gasped, backing away until I hit the rough stone wall. The figure stepped forward, a man, ragged and pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His clothes were torn, smeared with grime, and his mouth opened in a silent scream. What are you? I whispered, barely daring to breathe. His lips moved soundlessly, then a guttural growl escaped his throat. He lunged. I stumbled backward, tripping over a crate and crashing to the floor. The flashlight clattered away, plunging the cellar into darkness. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, hands outstretched, searching for the lantern or any light. My fingers grazed a cold metal object, the lantern. I grabbed it, shaking it until it flared to life. The man reeled back, shielding his eyes. I didn't wait. I scrambled up the stairs, bursting through the door and into the chilly night. The fog seemed thicker, pressing against my skin like a living thing. The footsteps behind me multiplied, echoing off the trees. I ran without looking back, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me. The village was nowhere in sight, only more forest and the faint glow of the bus station's lamp in the distance. When I finally reached the station, panting and bruised, the bus was gone. The booth was empty. I sank to the ground, clutching my side, the lantern's light bobbing in the darkness. I wasn't sure how long I sat there, shivering under the weight of the night, until headlights sliced through the fog. A pickup truck slowed to a stop, and a man stepped out. "Hey," he called, eyes narrowing as he took in my disheveled state. "You okay?" I nodded, too exhausted to speak. He helped me inside, locking the doors. As the truck pulled away, leaving the cursed forest behind, I realized I had no idea where I was or where I was going. But one thing was certain, whatever waited in those woods was still out there, and it wasn't finished with me yet. Story 4, Beneath the Silent Current. The water was colder than I expected that morning, a sharp bite beneath the calm surface that sat like glass over the bay. I hadn't been diving in a long time, not since before work swallowed most of my weekends, but something about the old maps I'd found in my grandfather's attic had pulled me back to the sea. His notes hinted at a wreck just off the coast, a fishing boat that vanished decades ago, swallowed by storms no one could outrun. The idea of exploring it stirred a strange sort of excitement in me, the kind that lives at the edge of fear. I loaded my kayak with the diving gear quietly, careful not to wake my roommate, who'd given me one of those looks last night when I announced my plans. Kayaking out to a dive site wasn't the most conventional approach, but the bay was shallow and tricky for larger boats, and I liked the solitude. The sun was just lifting over the horizon when I pushed off the shore, the paddle cutting through the water with soft, rhythmic splashes that echoed in the still morning air. The sky was a pale wash of pink and blue, the kind of dawn that promised clarity and calm. I kept my eyes on the water, scanning for any sign of a wreck, something jagged or unnatural beneath the surface. The bay curved around the peninsula, and past the trees I could see the faint silhouette of the cliffs where my grandfather's note said the boat had gone down. The place had a quiet beauty, but also a feeling like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I paddled steadily, my arms growing tired but my nerves sharpening. The water darkened as I approached the deeper part of the bay, and I slipped off the kayak, testing the temperature again with my hand before pulling on my wetsuit. Under the weight of the gear, the world narrowed to the rhythm of my breath and the pressure of the water around me. I kicked off from the side of the kayak, descending slowly, eyes adjusting to the dim green that filtered down through the waves. The wreck came into view almost exactly where the map had indicated. It wasn't much, a broken hull half buried in silt, the shape of the boat eroded by decades underwater. Barnacles and seaweed clung to it like rough scars, and fish darted in and out of the openings. It was hauntingly beautiful and sad, like a forgotten grave beneath the sea. I circled the wreck, careful not to disturb the sediment. My grandfather's notes mentioned a cargo crate rumored to hold something valuable, and though I didn't expect to find treasure, I wanted to see if there were any signs of it. Halfway around, something caught my eye, an unnatural glint beneath a fallen beam. I reached out with a gloved hand, brushing aside a layer of slimy growth to reveal a rusted metal box. Heart pounding, I pried it loose and secured it to my belt. The box was heavier than I thought, and as I turned to ascend, the water shifted suddenly. A current I hadn't noticed before tugged at me, pulling downward with a relentless pressure. Panic flickered in my chest. I kicked hard to fight it, but the weight of the box and my gear slowed me, dragging me toward a dark crevice in a rocky seabed I hadn't seen. I forced myself to stay calm, regulating my breath as I struggled against the pull. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the water, the sound vibrating through my bones in a way that made my skin crawl. The crevice widened in front of me, and I realized the current was funneling into an underwater cave. My instinct screamed to turn back, but the box was still tethered to me, and the thought of losing it made me push forward. Inside the cave, the water was colder and darker, the edges sharp and jagged. The beam of my dive light caught strange shapes, remnants of old nets, broken glass, and what looked like bones. I blinked, unsure if the darkness was playing tricks on me. Then something brushed against my leg, a slow, deliberate movement that didn't belong to any fish. I froze, the silence pressing in. My heart thundered in my chest, loud enough I was sure it would betray me. The water shifted again, and the shape returned, this time close enough that I could see it wasn't a creature but a tangle of ropes and debris swirling in the current. Relief mixed with a new unease. The cave was unstable, and the currents were unpredictable. I decided then to surface. With careful kicks, I pushed toward the opening above, but the narrow cave made it difficult. The box caught on a jagged edge, snagging me for a split second that felt like eternity. I forced myself to free it, gasping as I broke through into the murky daylight. Back on the surface, I rested against the kayak, gulping air and trying to steady my shaking hands. The box felt heavier now, as if it held more than rust and decay. I didn't know what was inside, but a cold thought crept into my mind: some things are meant to stay buried. As I paddled back toward shore, the wind picked up, and the sky darkened with thickening clouds. The bay, which had seemed so peaceful just hours before, now felt like a living thing watching me from every shadowed wave. I pulled the kayak onto the rocky beach and sat there for a long moment, the box beside me, wondering if I had just stumbled onto something I wasn't ready to face. The water whispered secrets, and I knew I'd be hearing them for a long time. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the surface of the lake when I climbed into the kayak, the chill seeping through my thin jacket despite the early sun trying to break through the clouds. The water was almost unnervingly still, mirroring the gray sky above. I had been staring at the shoreline for a long time, the dense trees lining the bank like silent sentinels guarding some secret I was only beginning to uncover. I pushed off, the paddle slicing quietly through the glassy water. My breath came out in small white puffs, and every sound felt sharper, the distant call of a loon, the soft slap of water against the hull, the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I had come here on a whim, chasing a restless urge I couldn't explain, but now, as I moved deeper into the lake, the unease settled over me like a weight. The dive shop had been closed when I arrived the day before, the windows dark and empty, but the owner's number was taped to the door. I had called, hoping to rent gear and explore the lake's depths, but the man's voice was clipped and unwilling. "This isn't a tourist spot," he warned. "The visibility's bad, and there have been accidents. Best to stay on the surface." I thanked him but felt the pull all the same. I had to see what was beneath. The water was cold, biting at my hands as I paddled toward the small cove where I planned to dive. The trees here grew close to the water's edge, their roots tangled in the shallows like gnarled fingers. I tied the kayak to a submerged branch and slid into the water, the chill shocking me as it claimed every inch of exposed skin. My wetsuit was thin, only a rental, and the cold found its way through the seams. I adjusted my mask and regulator, taking deep, steady breaths to calm the rising panic. The water was murky here, visibility barely a few feet. I descended slowly, the familiar weightlessness of being underwater offering a strange comfort amid the growing tension. I drifted downward, the lake floor coming into view dotted with rocks and thick mats of algae swaying gently in the faint current. It looked undisturbed, but the silence beneath the surface felt unnatural. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I expected from a secluded lake, it was heavier, as if something was watching. I moved closer to a cluster of submerged logs, roots twisting and curling in strange shapes. As I floated, my torch beam caught a flicker of movement, a shadow darting just beyond the edge of the light. My heart jumped. I spun around, scanning the murky depths, but there was nothing there. Just darkness and the slow pulse of water. I tried to shake off the feeling, to convince myself it was just a play of light and my own nerves. But as I turned back toward the surface, a sudden tug on my leg made me gasp underwater. I kicked frantically, pulling free from whatever had grabbed me, surfacing with a shocked gasp. The kayak was just a few feet away, rocking gently in the current. I hauled myself up, hands trembling, and sat there panting, listening to the water lap against the sides. Nothing moved. No ripples, no shadows, just the soft sound of the lake breathing. I debated packing it in. Maybe the dive shop owner was right. But then I noticed something on the hull of the kayak, a faint smear of mud or something darker, stuck near the edge. I wiped at it, but my fingers came away stained. Unease crept deeper. I pulled the kayak into a tiny inlet, tied it off to a tree, and sat on the bank to catch my breath. The forest around me felt closer here, the trees forming an oppressive wall that blocked the weak sunlight. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but I had no signal. The lake was too remote, the cell towers too few. As I sat there, I heard a faint splash from the water, distant but distinct. Like someone diving in. I froze, ears straining. Nothing followed, just the occasional drip of water from the branches overhead. I shook my head. Maybe I was imagining it. But then, a low sound came from the woods, a rustling, like footsteps moving quickly through the underbrush. I stood up, scanning the shadow trees. No one was there. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I knew I had to leave. Slowly, I made my way back to the kayak, the branches snapping softly beneath my boots. My eyes darted, trying to catch any sign of movement, but the forest remained still, eerily silent except for the occasional call of a bird. I shoved off and began paddling toward the dock where I had left my car. The lake stretched ahead, calm but foreboding, the morning light growing stronger but unable to banish the dark feeling clinging to me. Halfway back, my paddle struck something submerged. The sudden jolt sent a shock through the kayak as I looked down into the murky depths. A shape lay beneath the water, long and dark, partially covered in silt. I leaned over, heart pounding. It was the outline of a body. I blinked, trying to clear the water's distortion. The figure was face down, motionless, entangled in fishing lines or perhaps roots. The skin was pale, almost glowing faintly against the lake bed. I reached out instinctively, but pulled back, the cold fear gripping me. My mind raced. Who was it? How long had they been here? I tugged at my radio, hoping to reach someone, but the screen remained dark. No signal. I paddled faster, the urgency driving me forward. I needed help. I needed out. As I neared the dock, the sun broke fully through the clouds, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again, the peaceful lake, the chirping birds, the gentle breeze. But beneath the surface, I knew something was waiting, watching. Something that didn't want to be found. When I finally reached the shore and hauled the kayak out, my hand shook so badly I could barely unclip the straps. I pulled off my gear and stood there, staring back at the water, wondering how many secrets it held and how many of them were better left buried. The morning fog hung low over the lake, curling like smoke above the still water. I was already awake before dawn, the chill drawing goosebumps over my arms as I stood at the edge of the dock, kayak balanced on my shoulder. The air smelled damp and cold, a faint metallic tang that I couldn't place but felt pressing against my throat. After what had happened the day before, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be out here at all, but I had to know. I had to understand. Yesterday's dive had been unlike any I'd ever experienced. I had surfaced with that strange weight in my chest, a kind of silent horror that settled beneath the skin. I kept replaying the moments underwater, the way the shadows clung to the rocks, how the water around the sunken boat felt suddenly colder, as if the lake itself was aware of my presence. I pushed off from the dock, the kayak gliding over the water's glassy surface. My paddle sliced through the mist with soft, steady strokes. The lake was eerily silent, except for the distant call of a loon and the gentle slap of water against the hull. I headed toward the northwest cove, where the wreck sat half buried in silt, its wooden ribs exposed like a broken skeleton. As I neared the site, the fog began to thin, revealing the murky outline of the boat's hull beneath the surface. I tied my kayak to a nearby tree root and readied my gear. The dive this time was different. I had brought my underwater flashlight, a trick I'd never needed before on open water dives, but something about this place felt too dark, too hungry for light. The water was colder than I expected. I slipped beneath the surface, the lake swallowing me whole. I flicked on the flashlight, the narrow beam cutting through the gloom like a knife. The wreck loomed ahead, bigger than I remembered. The wood was rotted and slick with algae, the jagged edges like the teeth of some great beast. I moved slowly, my fins barely stirring the sediment at the bottom. Something brushed against my leg, a whisper of movement, too quick to identify, and my heart shot up. I forced myself to breathe evenly, the quiet hiss of my regulator filling my ears. I shone the beam over the wreck, searching for any signs of what might have dragged me down yesterday. There was nothing obvious, no fishing lines, no netting, no tangle of debris, but then I caught sight of something unnatural, a patch of blackened wood, like burnt flesh, peeling away from the hull. I reached out to touch it, but my fingers recoiled as a sudden current swept past me, stirring up a cloud of silt. I lost visibility instantly and kicked hard to stabilize myself. When the water cleared, the black patch was gone. It felt like the wreck itself was breathing, alive. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on my remaining air and the dive plan. I circled the boat, scanning every nook and cranny. On the far side, I spotted a narrow opening, waterlogged crates stacked haphazardly inside. I pushed myself through the gap, the beam of my flashlight illuminating the interior. Inside, the crates were empty except for a few shards of glass and twisted metal. But then I noticed something else, a small, leather-bound book wedged between two crates. I grabbed it carefully, the leather soft and waterlogged but intact. My fingers trembled as I opened it. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, the ink faded but legible. The entries were dated back over 50 years. They told the story of a fisherman named 𝐬𝐵𝐵𝐿, who had used this very boat. His writing was frantic, describing strange occurrences on the lake, sudden storms, vanishing fish, and an unseen presence that haunted the water. One passage stood out. Tonight, the lake took another. I heard the cries beneath the waves, pleading in silence. The water is alive with hunger, and I fear it will not release us. My breath hitched. The words echoed the unease I'd felt since arriving. I stuffed the book into my wetsuit's inner pocket and prepared to surface. As I ascended, the water around me shifted. A shadow darted just beyond my light's reach, too fast, too fluid to be a fish. I kicked harder, breaking the surface with a gasp. The boat rocked gently beside me, the fog closing in like a shroud. I climbed back into the kayak, heart pounding. The leather book was damp and heavy in my jacket pocket, a weight that dragged at my thoughts. The fog had thickened, muffling the world into a gray void. I scanned the tree line, but nothing looked familiar. Panic crept in. I had been certain of the route back, but now the shoreline seemed distant, distorted. I paddled forward, each stroke slower than the last. The silence pressed against me, broken only by a faint, rhythmic tapping from the water beneath the kayak. I froze, listening. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, like fingernails rapping on wood. I glanced down. The water was dark, swirling with currents I hadn't noticed before. A pale hand broke the surface for a moment, slender, elongated fingers, and then vanished. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only ripples. Breath caught in my throat. I spun the kayak around, heading back toward the dock. The tapping followed, now from all directions, echoing beneath the surface as if the lake itself was signaling me. My paddle struck the water wildly, fear driving me faster. The fog closed in, shadows shifting beneath me, forming shapes I couldn't quite define. I wanted to scream, but the cold lake air sucked the sound away. Suddenly, my kayak tilted sharply to one side. I reached out to steady it, but the water surged over the edge, dragging me under. I fought for the surface, lungs burning with cold. When I broke through, I saw the kayak floating upside down, bobbing like a corpse. The tapping had stopped. There was only silence and a thick, white fog. I swam toward the dock, hands scraping against the rough wood as I pulled myself out of the water. My clothes clung to me, cold and heavy. I sat there shivering, the book wet and dripping beside me. I wasn't sure what I had just seen, or if I had seen anything at all. But I knew one thing, the lake was not just water and silence. It was something else, something waiting beneath the surface, patient and hungry. And I didn't think it was going to let me go. The morning fog hung low over the lake when I pushed the kayak into the cold water, its surface smooth like glass, mirroring the gray sky above. The chill bit through my thin jacket as I settled myself and began to paddle, the rhythm slow at first, testing the silence that had settled over the bay since yesterday's storm. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something faint and unfamiliar that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just the rot of fallen leaves or maybe the decay of underwater plants disturbed by the turbulent waves. Yet, something deeper gnawed at me, an uneasy weight pressing beneath the surface. I headed toward the small cove where the wreck had been marked on the old diver's map I found tucked inside a dusty notebook in the local library. The map had no name, just a crude sketch of the shoreline with an X near a cluster of reeds and submerged logs. It was supposed to be a forgotten fishing boat, but no one I asked seemed to know anything about it, which only fueled my curiosity. The lake was supposed to be safe enough for diving, popular in summer, but it had its dangers, hidden snags, sudden drop-offs, and a history of drownings that locals spoke of in hushed tones. As I paddled closer to the cove, the water darkened, shadows lengthening under the overcast sky. The reeds whispered softly with the breeze, but the sound seemed distant, as if muffled by something unseen. I pulled the kayak into the shallows, careful not to disturb the bottom. The map suggested the wreck lay in about 15 feet of water, just beyond the reeds. I clipped my gear to the kayak, strapped on my mask and fins, and slipped into the lake, the cold shock taking my breath for a moment before I forced myself to relax. Underwater, the world shifted. The gray light above filtered down in broken beams, illuminating floating particles that caught the faintest glint. I moved slowly, hand trailing along submerged branches and rocks, searching for the shape of the wreck. My heart hammered in my chest, the silence thick and oppressive, broken only by the muffled sound of bubbles rising to the surface. I found the hull first, the curved shape of the boat settled awkwardly among the weeds, its paint chipped and peeling, barnacles clinging to the worn wood. I circled the wreck, documenting it with my waterproof camera, the lens fogging slightly in the cold water. Then something caught my eye, a dark opening near the stern, just big enough for a diver to slip inside. I hesitated. The space inside looked cramped and filled with debris, but the promise of discovery was too strong. I adjusted my mask, took a deep breath, and pushed myself forward. The interior was a tangle of broken wood and rusted metal. My flashlight cut through the murk, revealing a tangle of ropes and a rusted anchor wedged against the hull. The smell of decay was stronger here, thick and metallic. As I explored, my hand brushed against something smooth and unnatural, cold and hard, unlike any wood or metal I'd seen. I reached out and pulled, uncovering a small, sealed metal box, corroded but intact. My heart sped up. The box was heavy and strangely warm in my glove. I secured it in a mesh bag and swam back out, the confined space behind me swallowing the light as I broke the surface. I climbed back into the kayak, dripping and shivering, my mind racing with questions about the box's contents. The fog had thickened while I was underwater, turning the lake into a gray void with no visible shore. The silence was absolute except for the soft slap of the paddle against water. I checked my compass, trying to orient myself, but the needle jittered erratically. A creeping sense of disorientation settled in, as if the lake itself was shifting and rearranging beneath me. I paddled toward the nearest landmark, a lone, dead tree jutting from the water like a skeletal finger. As I drew closer, a sudden movement caught my eye, a shadow darting just beneath the surface, too large and purposeful to be a fish. My breath hitched as the shape circled beneath the kayak, slow and deliberate. Panic flared. I gripped the paddle tighter, scanning the water for any sign of what was beneath me. Then it surfaced, just for a moment, a pale, distorted face staring up at me with hollow eyes, lips pulled back in a grimace I couldn't decipher. The water rippled violently, and the figure sank again, leaving only swirling eddies in its wake. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a floating root or a shadow cast by the dead tree, but the terror stuck with me. My hands trembled as I paddled away, faster now, heart pounding like a drum in my ears. The metal box lay beside me in the kayak, ominous and silent. Back at the dock, I hauled the kayak onto the shore, my legs unsteady beneath me. The village was quiet, the few houses shuttered early against the oppressive weather. I sat on the steps of my rental cabin, the box on my lap, the weight of it anchoring me to the moment. Curiosity battled with fear as I pried the corroded latch open. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, was a journal, its pages waterlogged but legible. The ink was smudged in places, but the handwriting was clear, a man's hurried scrawl, chronicling days spent on the lake, his obsession with the wreck growing with each entry. The final page ended abruptly, the ink fading into a smear of water stains. I read the last words aloud, voice barely above a whisper. They watch from beneath. The lake is not empty. It takes what it needs. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the world whole. The lake was no longer just a body of water, it was something alive, watching, waiting. And I was no longer sure I wanted to uncover its secrets. I didn't sleep that night, the journal resting on my chest as the wind howled through the trees. Every creak and groan of the cabin made me jump, every shadow seemed to pulse with unseen movement. Somewhere, out on the lake, something stirred. When dawn came, pale and fragile, I knew I had to leave. But the metal box was still there, unopened, its mysteries calling to me even as dread wrapped tighter around my heart. I was caught between the urge to run and the need to understand, caught in the silent grip of the lake's dark secret. The morning fog clung low over the bay like a shroud, thick and suffocating. I woke before dawn, the unrelenting chill of the damp air sinking into my bones despite the heavy jacket I'd thrown over myself the night before. The storm had passed, but the world still felt unsettled, as if it were holding its breath. I sat on the edge of the worn wooden dock, my feet skimming the cold water. The kayaks were tethered loosely nearby, their hulls rocking gently with the tide. The events of the last few days churned in my mind but felt distant, like echoes from someone else's nightmare. Yet I knew better. The fear was real. The kind that burrows into your skin and lingers long after the immediate threat has gone. I was supposed to meet Mark and Sarah for a dive today, to check out that new wreck site we'd heard about from the local fishermen, a small trawler that had gone down decades ago, rumored to be resting just beyond the mouth of the cove. I wanted to say no, but I knew I wouldn't. That compulsion to keep going, to prove I wasn't losing my mind, was too strong. I pulled on my wetsuit, the neoprene clinging to my skin cold and stiff. Outside, the light was dim but growing, the gray sky shifting to a pale blue. I strapped my dive gear onto the kayak, checking and double-checking everything, oxygen tanks, dive computer, knife, light. The water was calm now, deceptively serene. I could almost forget about the darkness lurking beneath the surface. Mark showed up a few minutes later, his usual easygoing smile replaced by a tight set to his jaw. Sarah followed, her eyes red-rimmed, but she didn't say much. None of us spoke about the strange noises we'd all heard the night before, or the shadows moving just beyond the tree line when we'd been preparing our equipment. It was like an unspoken rule: acknowledge the fear, but don't give it power. We launched the kayaks into the water and paddled silently toward the wreck site. The bay stretched out in front of us, a vast expanse of gray and blue, the only sound the splash of paddle blades breaking the surface. The fog had started to lift, but the horizon remained hazy, blurring the line between water and sky. My heart hammered in my chest, a rhythm keeping time with the rising tension. When we reached the coordinates Mark had marked on his GPS, we slipped into the water one by one, the cold biting through my wetsuit as I sank beneath the surface. The world above vanished, replaced by the muted quiet of the underwater realm. Everything was a distorted dreamscape of shifting light and shadow. I followed the familiar trail of the wreck's silhouette as it emerged from the murky depths. The trawler lay on its side, barnacles encrusting its hull, the rusted metal groaning faintly as currents nudged it. I ran my gloved hand along the side, the texture rough and alien. The rest of the team was close by, their bubbles rising like ghosts in the dim water. I remembered the feeling I had on my first dive here, the way the wreck seemed to watch you, almost alive. Today, that sensation was stronger, more insistent. My dive light swept across the broken windows and twisted beams, catching on something that made me freeze. A figure. Or at least, it looked like one. At first, I thought it was another diver, but as the beam traced the shape, I realized it was too still, too unnatural. What I saw was a mass tangled in thick seaweed, limbs bent at odd angles, hair drifting in the water like dark smoke. The figure's face was hidden, but the outline was unmistakable humanoid, but disturbingly lifeless. I swallowed hard, the air in my tank feeling suddenly insufficient. "Hey," I called softly into my regulator, signaling to Mark and Sarah. They swam closer, their lights converging on the figure. Mark reached out hesitantly, the tip of his gloved fingers brushing the seaweed that obscured the face. He recoiled immediately, a grimace flashing across his features. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling even through the regulator. "Is that?" Before I could respond, the figure shifted. Just slightly. A twitch. The water seemed to pulse with it, a slow ripple that set my skin crawling. I blinked hard, trying to shake the image, but when I looked back, it was gone. The space where it had been was empty, just water and sediment stirred by our movements. We surfaced quickly, the cold air hitting me like a slap. On the kayaks, we exchanged glances thick with unspoken questions. None of us said it out loud, but I knew we all saw the same thing. Whatever it was, it had been alive. Or it had been once. Back on shore, I sat against a tree, my breathing ragged and uneven. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, but the warmth did nothing to chase away the dread gnawing in my gut. Mark lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward as he stared out at the water. "So," he said finally, "you think it was some kind of animal? Like a seal or something?" I shook my head. "No. It looked human." Sarah shivered. "Maybe it's someone who drowned, trapped down there." The idea made my stomach twist. The waters here were cold and deep, but the currents could carry bodies far from where they went under. We had all heard the stories, the missing kayakers, the divers who never came back. I tried to dismiss them as local legend, but now I wasn't so sure. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the tent's-thin nylon ceiling, listening to the wind moan through the trees. I wasn't alone. Sarah and Mark were just a few feet away, but I felt utterly isolated. The image of that figure haunted me, dark tendrils of seaweed drifting in the black water, waiting. I thought about going back out tomorrow, to dive alone, to find some rational explanation. But as I drifted towards sleep, I realized I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I was waiting for something beneath the surface, something that wasn't ready to be found. The bay was no longer just water and waves. It was a cage, and I was inside it. Story 5, Silent Prayers of the Forsaken. The night I came back to Hollow Creek felt heavier than I remembered. The air hung thick with an almost tangible stillness, the kind that presses against your skin and refuses to let go. I hadn't planned on being here, at least, not yet, but when the call came, I couldn't ignore it. It was Father Bennett's voice, low and tremulous, the kind of voice that cracks when years of silence finally break. "Emily, you need to come home," he had said. "It's urgent." Home was an old farmhouse on the edge of town, nestled between gnarled trees that clawed at the sky, their branches casting long, skeletal shadows in the moonlight. Even after all this time, the place felt suffocating. The paint peeled like dead skin, and the windows stared out like empty eye sockets. My mother had died here, years ago, and since then, the house had been left to rot. I hadn't set foot inside for nearly a decade. But tonight, I crossed the threshold without hesitation. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't place. I could almost taste it, bitter and metallic, like rust and regret. The floorboards groaned under my weight, a low moan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. I moved slowly, each step measured, as if the house itself was watching, waiting. I found Father Bennett in what used to be the living room. He sat hunched over, clutching a worn leather-bound book in one hand and a crucifix in the other. His face was pale, eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles that betrayed sleepless nights. When he saw me, a flicker of relief crossed his features. "Thank God you came," he whispered. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely more than a breath. He swallowed hard, glancing toward the hallway. "It's Hannah. She's not, well, something's wrong with her. Hannah was my younger sister, the reason I was here. When Mom died, Hannah was just 7, and I promised her I'd always look out for her. But life had a way of pulling me away, and I hadn't been around when she needed me most." "I don't understand," I said, stepping closer. Father Bennett's eyes flicked toward the narrow hallway. "She's changed. Not just her mood or behavior, something darker. We think it might be possession." The word hung between us like a curse. I'd always dismissed such things as superstition or paranoia. Ghost stories for children. But looking at Father Bennett now, I could see the weight of his fear was real. "Show me," I said, my heart pounding. He led me down the hallway, the light from his lantern casting jittery shadows on cracked walls. At the end was Hannah's room, the door shut tight. We exchanged a look before he pushed it open. Inside, the air was colder. The bed was unmade, sheets tangled in disarray. But it was Hannah who drew my attention. She sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly. Her eyes were open, but they didn't seem to see me. They were glassy, unfocused, reflecting the faint light in a way that made me shiver. "Hannah?" I whispered. She didn't respond. Instead, her head twisted slowly, unnaturally, so that her gaze locked onto me. A slow, menacing smile spread across her lips, one that didn't belong to my sister. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Father Bennett stepped forward, clutching the crucifix tighter. "She's fighting," he muttered. "But the entity is strong." I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but a cold dread rooted me to the spot. The room seemed to pulse with a silent energy, thick and suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. "Is there anything we can do?" I asked. Father Bennett's gaze darkened. "We need to perform an exorcism," he said quietly. "It's dangerous, but if we don't act now..." His words trailed off, but the implication was clear. If we waited, Hannah could be lost forever. I swallowed my fear and nodded. "Tell me what to do." He handed me a small vial of holy water and an old prayer book. His voice was steady but strained as he explained the ritual. The night stretched ahead of us, and the house seemed to grow darker with every passing minute. As Father Bennett began to recite the prayers, I held the vial tightly, my hands trembling. Hannah's body tensed, the unnatural smile fading to a scowl. She hissed, a sound that was part anger, part agony. The air grew colder still, and a painful pressure pressed against my chest. I glanced at Father Bennett. His voice never wavered, but sweat glistened on his brow. Suddenly, Hannah's eyes snapped toward me, blazing with a fury that wasn't her own. "Leave," the voice snarled, but the lips moving didn't belong to my sister. I took a step back, fear flooding through me, but I reminded myself why I was here. For her. For my sister. "Stay with me, Hannah," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "Fight it. I'm here." The room seemed to shudder, a low groan reverberating through the walls. The shadows shifted, as if alive, And then, just as suddenly as it began, the tension eased. Hannah collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, real tears streaming down her cheeks. I rushed to her side, wrapping my arms around her. Father Bennett exhaled, exhausted. "We've won this battle," he said softly. "But the war isn't over." I knew then that nothing would ever be the same. The darkness had touched my family, and I was caught in its grip. The night outside remained silent, but inside that old house, something had woken up. And it wasn't done yet. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the silence. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I lay still for a moment, trying to remember where I was. The room was cramped and dim, the dull light of early morning filtering through thin curtains. The walls were faded, peeling in places, and the musty odor of old wood and damp lingered in the air. I realized I was on the couch in the living room of my great-aunt's house, an old Victorian she had left me after she passed last year. I hadn't expected to be here so soon, but after the nightmare I'd had last night, it felt like I had no choice. The nightmare had been vivid and terrifying. I was standing in the hallway of this very house, but everything looked twisted, walls bleeding, doorways stretched and warped. There was a shadow behind me, a figure that whispered my name in a voice that wasn't my own. I had woken up gasping, covered in sweat, convinced I'd heard footsteps out in the hall. The logical part of me tried to dismiss it as a dream, but the unease settled deep in my chest, refusing to let go. I rubbed my eyes and sat up slowly, feeling the stiffness in my neck and shoulders. I wasn't sure how long I'd been out, but the clock on the mantelpiece read 5:17 a.m. too early to get up, but I couldn't sleep anymore. The house felt different in the daylight, but not in a good way. The shadows clung to the corners of the room like thick cobwebs, and every creak of the floorboards sounded louder than it should. I got up and walked to the window, pulling aside the curtain. The street outside was empty except for a few stray leaves drifting in the cold morning breeze. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet, and from here I could see the church across the street, a small, old building with weathered stone and a rusted bell tower. I hadn't thought much about the church until now. Aunt Margaret had been a devout woman, always talking about faith and the importance of prayer. But there was something else about her that I never quite understood, something that felt darker, like a secret wrapped in layers of piety. I shook the thought away and decided to make some coffee. The kitchen was just behind the living room, cramped and outdated, but functional. As I filled the kettle and plugged in the coffee maker, I noticed a small, leather-bound book lying on the counter. It hadn't been there yesterday. I picked it up cautiously. The cover was cracked and worn, and the title was embossed in faded gold letters, Exorcisms and Deliverance. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't told anyone about the strange noises or the feeling of being watched in the house. How did this book get here? I flipped it open, skimming the dense text and handwritten notes in the margins. It was a journal of sorts, filled with prayers, rituals, and descriptions of demonic possession. Some entries were dated recently. I frowned. Could my aunt have been involved in something like this? I didn't remember her ever mentioning anything unusual, just the usual Sunday sermons and church events. A sudden noise made me jump. It was a soft thud from upstairs, followed by the faint sound of footsteps. I froze, listening. The house was supposed to be empty except for me. My mind raced, maybe a raccoon in the attic, or an old pipe shifting. But the footsteps were deliberate, slow, almost purposeful. I told myself to stay calm and went to the staircase. The steps creaked under my weight. Halfway up, the smell hit me, a foul, sulfurous stench that made my stomach churn. It wasn't the scent of mold or rot. It was something else, something unnatural. At the end of the hallway was the guest bedroom, a small room my aunt had used for visitors. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, heart pounding, and stepped inside. The room was empty except for a single wooden chair facing the window. The curtains fluttered in the breeze from an open window, but the chair was unusual. It was turned away from the window, facing the wall. On the backrest, there was a smear of something dark, almost black. I moved closer and realized it was dried blood. A cold wave of fear crashed over me. I wanted to run, to get out of the house, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Then I heard a whisper, soft but clear, coming from the corner near the closet. "Leave, now." I spun toward the voice, but there was no one there. Just shadows crawling along the walls. My breath came fast and shallow. I backed out of the room, slammed the door shut, and leaned against it, trying to steady myself. That's when I heard the knocking. Slow, deliberate, coming from the front door downstairs. I looked at the clock, still too early for visitors. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crept downstairs, every nerve on edge. The knocking continued, echoing through the quiet house. I reached the door and glanced through the peephole. No one was there. I hesitated, then unlocked and opened the door a crack. The porch was empty. Only the cold wind blowing leaves across the steps. I stepped outside, shining the flashlight around. The street remained deserted. I closed the door and locked it again, the sense of unease growing heavier. Back inside, I sat at the kitchen table, the book still open in front of me. As I flipped through it again, I found a passage describing signs of possession, changes in voice, sudden aggression, aversion to sacred objects. I swallowed hard, realizing some of the recent strange behaviors I'd noticed in myself made sense now. The nightmares, the whispers, the feeling that something was trying to take over. I didn't want to admit it, but maybe this wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe my aunt's death wasn't the end of whatever she'd been fighting. Maybe I was next. The morning light grew stronger, but the house felt darker than ever. I knew I couldn't stay here alone. I needed help, someone who understood this kind of evil. I called Father Callahan, the priest from the church across the street. His voice was calm but serious when he answered. I told him everything, the book, the noises, the blood, the whispers. He said he would come by as soon as he could. As I hung up, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, watching me. I wasn't alone in this house. And whatever was with me wasn't going anywhere. The real horror was just beginning. I woke up before dawn, the faint chill in the air crawling under the thin blanket I had barely pulled over my shoulders. The room was suffused with that gray, pre-light gloom that makes everything seem heavier, more uncertain. I lay still, staring at the dark corners where shadows pooled, waiting for some sign that the nightmare had resumed, or maybe that it had never really ended. But for a moment, all was silent. That silence felt wrong. Oppressive. Like the calm before a storm that was more than weather. I didn't want to move, not yet. My body felt too raw, as if sleep had been a thin membrane separating me from something worse, something unseen but still palpably close. The memories from the night before slithered back, her voice twisting in unnatural ways, the cold that leached into the bones of that room, the way the air had thickened, almost suffocating. I had thought the priest's words, the ritual, might have broken it. I wanted to believe it was over. But deep down, I knew better. Something in the house was still watching me. A soft creak from the hallway made my heart spike. I sat up abruptly, the blankets falling to the floor. The small lamp on the nightstand was off. No electricity had been restored since the storm knocked the power out 2 days ago. I reached blindly for my phone, the screen's dim light illuminating the room just enough to reveal empty walls and the open door to the hallway stretching into darkness. No signal. I cursed under my breath. Not that I had anyone to call at this hour anyway. The storm had isolated me more than I wanted to admit, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. The sense of being utterly alone settled like a weight on my chest. A faint shuffling sound came again, this time closer, just outside my bedroom door. My pulse hammered in my ears as I gripped the edge of the bed. The doorknob jiggled, slow and deliberate. Whoever or whatever was there wanted in. I forced myself to stand, every muscle protesting. The memory of the choking hold the entity had on me, the way it had tried to drag me into its darkness, made my legs tremble. But I couldn't stay paralyzed. Not again. Who's there? My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. The door creaked open, and a shadow slipped through the gap. I squinted, trying to make out a shape in the gloom. It was her. My sister, or at least what looked like her. But her eyes, black and empty, locked on me with something that wasn't human. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. The coldness radiating from her was so intense, it was like being pressed against ice. She tilted her head, a twisted imitation of the child I knew. No warmth, no recognition. I shook my head, trying to dispel the hallucination. Lisa? The name tasted bitter. My sister had been gone from my life for years, left after that terrible night at our parents' house. I thought I left the past behind with her. She stepped forward, voice a low, guttural hiss. You cannot hide. Then she laughed. It was a hollow sound like metal scraping bone. My skin crawled. I backed away, I starting for anything to defend myself. The nightstand, the lamp, a book, anything. She advanced, slow and inevitable. I grabbed the lamp, yanking it off the table, the bulb shattering on the floor. The feeble glow painted her features in grotesque relief, sunken cheeks, pallid skin stretched tight, veins dark and writhing beneath it. It was no longer my sister, but a vessel. Go away, I whispered, shaking as I raised a broken lamp like a weapon. She stopped, tilting her head again, as if amused. You're still weak, she said. But the thing inside me grows. My breath caught. The thing inside me that had to be the possession. The demon or spirit that had latched onto Lisa years ago, the same one that had been trying to claim me since I returned. I had confronted it with the priest, with prayers and holy water, but it was clear now that was only the beginning. I swung the lamp clumsily as she lunged. The contact was cold and hard, but she moved through it like mist, unaffected. My arms ached as I stumbled back again, panic flooding every nerve. Suddenly, the room was filled with a low, chanting sound, deep and guttural, like an ancient prayer in a language I couldn't understand. It came from nowhere and everywhere. My head throbbed, and I fell to my knees, clutching my ears. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. The doorway stood empty, the room silent except for my ragged breathing. I tried to process what had just happened. Was it real? Had I imagined it? The room still felt heavy, like the atmosphere had been poisoned. I knew better. It was real. This thing had followed me here, and it wasn't done. I needed help. Not just the priest, whose rituals had only bought me time. I needed someone who understood this darkness, who could fight it without faltering. I thought about Father Collins, the old man who had performed the exorcism years ago in the neighboring town. He was reluctant to come back here, afraid of what this entity was capable of. But he was the only one I could trust. I grabbed my coat and phone, heading for the door. The storm outside had passed, leaving the world soaked and cold, but at least the power was flickering back. I forced myself to move through the house quickly, every creak and groan making me jump. As I reached the porch, my phone buzzed a single text from an unknown number. Stop. It's already inside you. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, heart pounding so loud I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. I didn't know how it had gotten my number, or how this demon could reach me through technology, but one thing was clear: it was no longer just in Lisa. It had found a way in me. I backed into the house, locking the door behind me. This was bigger than anything I had imagined. The entity was not just a haunting or a possession. It was a predator, patient and cunning, and now it hunted me too. I sank to the floor, eyes fixed on the dark corners of the room, waiting for the next move. And I knew it was coming. The night had been thick with an oppressive silence, the kind that fills every corner of a house when something is terribly wrong but refuses to show itself openly. I sat on the edge of the sofa in the living room, the dim light of a single lamp casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Outside, rain pattered lightly against the window pane, but inside, the air was suffocating, charged with a tension I couldn't shake. I hadn't slept since the incident, since Sarah had started talking in that voice that wasn't hers. For days now, she'd been locked in her room, refusing to come out, her behavior shifting from withdrawn to violently unpredictable. The doctor had dismissed it as a psychological breakdown, but I knew better. There was something else. Something I couldn't explain and, more frighteningly, something I had no means to stop. I heard the slow creak of the bedroom door, the way it protested against the hinges like it always did, but tonight, that sound unnerved me more than usual. I glanced toward the hallway just in time to see Sarah step into the living room. Her eyes caught the light and glinted with a strange coldness. It wasn't her. I could tell immediately. Her hands hung limp at her sides, but the energy radiating from her was palpable, like a dark current running just beneath the surface. She didn't speak. Instead, she began to walk toward me, each step deliberate, almost mechanical. My heart hammered in my chest, but I didn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my mind racing through every horror story I'd ever heard, every warning that had ever crossed my path. Then she stopped, standing mere feet away. Her voice came out in a low, guttural tone, unfitting of the sweet girl I knew. "He's coming," she said, and the words sent a chill down my spine. "He's hungry." I swallowed hard. "Who, Sarah? Who's hungry?" She smiled then, but it was wrong, too wide, too sharp. "The one who never leaves. The one who wants inside." The room seemed to grow colder, the lamplight flickering as if struggling against some unseen force. I wanted to tell her to stop, to speak normally, but fear held my tongue. I wasn't sure if she even knew what she was saying. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, slicing through the silence. I jumped, my body tense as I moved toward the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and at this late hour, the sound was ominous. When I opened it, a man stood there. Mid-30s, with a weathered face and eyes that looked like they had seen too much. He wore a simple coat, soaked from the rain, and carried a small black bag in one hand. He introduced himself as Father Matthews. "I heard you might need help," he said quietly, his voice steady but kind. "May I come in?" Relief washed over me, mixed with a fresh surge of apprehension. "Please," I said, stepping aside. He moved through the house with purpose, setting his bag down by the fireplace. "Tell me everything," he urged, looking directly at me. I did. I told him about Sarah's strange behavior, the voices, the freezing cold, the locked doors, and the way she looked at me just a moment ago, like something else was behind her eyes. Father Matthews nodded solemnly. "Possession is rare, but it's real," he said. "I've dealt with cases like this before. We'll need to be careful." He asked to see Sarah, so I led him upstairs. The hallway felt longer and darker than before, shadows pooling in the corners. When we reached her door, it was closed tight. I hesitated, then knocked. A voice answered, low and distorted. "Who is it?" "It's Father Matthews," he said. "I'm here to help." The door creaked open slowly, and Sarah stood there, her body tense, ice darting between us. The moment she saw Father Matthews, her expression twisted into a sneer that instantly erased any trace of the girl I knew. "You can't save her," the voice said through her, but the words were his, not hers. "She belongs to me now." Father Matthews stepped forward calmly. "In the name of all that is holy, I command you to leave her." The room seemed to shudder. The air thickened, damp and heavy. Sarah's body convulsed slightly, an unnatural sound coming from deep within her throat. It was a guttural growl, something not human. "You're brave," the entity said, "but this house, this body, they are mine." Father Matthews pulled out a small cross and held it up, whispering prayers in Latin. The effect was immediate. Sarah's body jerked violently, and the voice screamed in rage, shaking the walls. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I watched as the man continued, sweat beading on his forehead, his voice unwavering even as the atmosphere turned suffocating. Hours passed. I lost track of time. The room darkened and brightened in waves, shadows twisting into grotesque shapes. Sarah was thrashing now, crying out in a voice that was both hers and not. Finally, with a final cry that echoed through the house, she collapsed into stillness. Father Matthews sank to his knees, breathing heavily. "It's not over," he said. "This spirit is strong. We'll need to do this again. And soon." I nodded, my mind numb. The battle had just begun, and I was already afraid of what it might cost us. The night had grown heavy by the time I found myself sitting alone in the cold kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator a small, constant reminder that the world outside our house was still moving, indifferent to the chaos inside. I was staring at the chipped edge of a coffee cup, trying to piece together the fragments of what had just unfolded, but the images kept slipping through my mind like water through fingers. Emily, my sister, was lying upstairs, her body finally still after what felt like hours of torment. The priest had left moments ago, his car's headlights disappearing into the darkness, leaving only the faint whisper of the wind against the cracked window panes. I wanted to believe this was over. I needed to believe it. But the silence was too thick, too unnatural. I remembered the way Emily's voice had twisted, how it had become a low, guttural growl that wasn't her at all. The way her eyes, so familiar and warm, had turned pitch black, void of everything human. I thought I'd seen death before, but this was different. This was something ancient and hungry, scraping at the edges of reality with claws I couldn't see. When the priest began the exorcism, I stood rigid in the doorway, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. The old man's words were in Latin, a language I barely understood, but the force behind them was undeniable. I watched as Emily convulsed, the room filling with a cold so fierce it seemed to suck all the air from my lungs. Shadows flickered and danced on the walls, cast by the flickering candles the priest had brought. At one point, I thought I saw a shape lingering just behind the priest, a dark silhouette that moved independently of the light. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of nerves and lack of sleep. But something in me knew better. After the ritual, the priest had told me to stay calm, to keep Emily safe and to avoid certain objects in the house, things he refused to name but described as anchors for the entity's return. I had nodded numbly, not trusting my voice. Now, sitting alone, I realized I had no idea what I was supposed to do next. The priest had said the possession was unusual, that it might not be over. The way he said it left no room for doubt. I heard a faint creak from upstairs. My whole body tensed. The house was old, and it made noises all the time, but this was different. Deliberate. I told myself to breathe, to remind myself that Emily was asleep. That the priest was right, whatever had been in her was gone. But the creaking came again, a slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps on the wooden floor above. I forced myself to stand, every muscle screaming in protest, and made my way toward the staircase. The air was colder here, thicker, and I could smell something faint burning, or maybe something worse, like sulfur. I swallowed hard. "Emily," my voice was barely a whisper. No answer. I climbed the stairs slowly, the wooden steps groaning under my weight. At the top, the hall stretched out, dimly lit by a single bulb that flickered like a dying flame. I remembered the priest's warning to keep the doors closed. I glanced toward Emily's room. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with trembling hands. The room was dark, but the moonlight filtered in through the curtains, casting a pale glow over the scattered toys and books. Emily lay on her bed, face peaceful and pale. I stepped closer and reached out to touch her forehead. It was cold, almost icy. She was breathing, slow and steady. But then I noticed something else. Her eyes were open. Not the warm brown eyes I knew, but wide and glassy, reflecting the faint light like a cat's. "Emily," I said again, this time louder. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't understand. The voice was low, gravelly, almost a whisper, but filled with menace. I stepped back, heart racing. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the small room. I spun around, my back pressing against the cold wood. The room seemed to contract, shadows stretching and twisting along the walls. "Who's there?" I demanded, even though I knew the answer. The voice came again, this time clearer, a sickening parody of my sister's. "You cannot stop me," it said. I felt a wave of nausea, and the room seemed to tilt. I stumbled, clutching the edge of the bed. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, but I knew I was lying. The creature in Emily's body laughed, a sound that was both chilling and impossible to describe. It wasn't human, but it was mocking me all the same. I knew then that the exorcism hadn't worked. Not really. Whatever had taken hold of Emily was still inside her, waiting. Watching. I backed toward the door, fumbling with the handle. It wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I banged on the wood, screaming for help, but the owls swallowed my voice whole. The voice whispered again, this time right behind me. "You belong to me now." I spun around, but no one was there. Just the empty room and the pale moonlight. Suddenly, Emily's body convulsed violently, her limbs jerking in unnatural ways. I wanted to run, but my legs were frozen. I had never felt so powerless. Then her eyes locked onto mine, those black, endless eyes, and for a moment, I saw something flicker beneath them. A flash of my sister's true self, trapped and screaming silently, begging me to save her. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched her face. She was cold, impossibly cold, and yet I felt something beneath the surface, a fragile thread of life. "Hold on, Emily," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm not giving up on you." The room seemed to breathe around us, shadows drawing closer, and I realized I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't begin to understand. The line between this world and whatever had claimed my sister was thinner than I ever imagined. But I would cross it if I had to. For Emily, I would face whatever darkness waited in the shadows. Because she was still in there. Somewhere. And I wouldn't let her go without a fight. Story 6, Frozen Secrets Beneath the Snowstorm. The morning started like any other winter day, cold, gray, with the kind of heavy sky that promised snow but didn't yet deliver it. I had planned to leave town early, driving the long, winding road back to my apartment several hours away. The town was small, the sort that shrinks in the winter while everyone huddles inside, and I was looking forward to the quiet of my place. But the weather had other ideas. I remember the first flakes falling because I paused, watching them drift down lazily against the dull sky. just a few, at first, light and scattered. I thought nothing of it, slipping into my coat and locking the door behind me. The cold bit in my cheeks as I crossed the parking lot to my car, the snow gathering softly on the hood, white and pristine. Driving out of town went smoothly. The roads were clear, pavement black against the white landscape. But by the time I reached the highway, the flakes had thickened, turning into a steady, relentless fall. I turned on the defroster to keep the windshield clear and slowed down, the tires crunching carefully on the thin layer of snow accumulating beneath them. Visibility dropped quickly. What had been broad, open fields blurred into an indistinct expanse of white and gray. It was somewhere past the county line that things began to feel wrong. The snowstorm intensified faster than I expected, the wind howling through the gaps in the trees lining the road. The steady rhythm of the wipers couldn't keep the window clear. I pulled over briefly to wipe the glass by hand, peering out into the swirling white, the world outside reduced to a disorienting blur. I considered turning back, but the storm showed no sign of letting up. The radio crackled with warnings about road closures and accidents ahead. I wasn't sure how far I could get before the roads became impassable. The highway signs disappeared behind thick curtains of snow, and I realized I'd been following the wrong exit for some time. The road curved sharply, a narrow two-lane that rose and fell over hills barely visible beneath the blanket of white. I told myself to stay calm, to keep driving. But then the headlights of another vehicle appeared suddenly behind me, close enough that I could see the headrest and the glow of the driver's face through the frosted window. The car tailgated me for miles, its bright beams stabbing into my rearview mirror, making it harder to see. I felt an edge of irritation, but the storm made me nervous, and the idea of speeding up was more frightening than the tailgater's impatience. The road narrowed further, bordered by trees that leaned over in frozen arches, their branches heavy with snow. At one point, a gust of wind whipped a clump of ice loose from a tree and struck my windshield with a sharp crack. My heart jumped, and I pulled over, hands trembling as I sat in silence, listening to the storm rage outside. That's when I noticed the lights in the distance, faint and flickering through the white haze. At first, I thought it was a house or maybe a small cabin. The idea of shelter was tempting, so I got out and walked toward them, boots crunching in the deepening snow. The air was bitter, sharp enough to sting inside my coat. The lights grew closer, revealing a small wooden building with a sagging porch and a single dim lamp swinging in the wind. The door was ajar. I called out but heard nothing except the whistle of the storm. I pushed the door open wider, stepping inside. The interior was dark and smelled of damp wood and stale smoke. Old furniture sat covered in sheets, dust motes floating in the weak glow of the lamp. I glanced around, feeling suddenly exposed and vulnerable in this abandoned place. Then I heard it. A faint sound from the back room, a soft shuffling, like something moving just beyond the door frame. My breath hitched, and I strained my eyes in the gloom. The front door creaked behind me as a fresh blast of wind swept through, rattling the windows and making the old house groan. I called out again, voice rough and uncertain. No reply, but the noise came again, more insistent this time. Heart pounding, I edged toward the doorway. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the howling wind outside. I reached the threshold and peered into the shadowed room. There was nothing visible at first, only the faint outline of a broken chair and a cracked mirror leaning against the far wall. But then movement, a blur, too quick to be sure, flickered at the edge of my vision. I blinked, and it was gone. I stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind me with a sudden bang that made me jump. The room felt colder somehow, the temperature dropping sharply. My breath fogged in the stale air. I fumbled for my phone, the screen lighting up my hands. No signal. The snowstorm had cut me off completely. I turned back to the door, but it wouldn't budge, frozen shut or jammed. Panic flared up in my chest. I was trapped. And then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, coming from the far corner of the room, the sound muffled but unmistakable on the wooden floor. I froze, every muscle tense. There was no one else in the house, or so I thought. But now I knew I was wrong. The footsteps stopped. Silence swallowed the room again, thick and suffocating. I strained my ears, waiting for something, anything, to tell me what was happening. But the only sound was the storm outside, relentless and unforgiving, trapping me in a place I didn't belong. I didn't know then how long I stayed there, how the minutes stretched like hours, or how the darkness seemed to grow heavier all around me. The snowstorm raged on, burying the world outside in silence and cold. And in that silence, I realized I was now alone. When the snow started falling, it was light at first, just a few flakes drifting lazily against the dull gray sky. I had been standing outside the cabin for only a few minutes, trying to get a better look at the woods that stretched endlessly beyond the clearing. The trees were heavy with frost, their branches brittle and white, bending under the weight. The cold was sharper than I expected, creeping past my jacket and settling deep into my bones. I should have gone back inside, but something held me there, eyes scanning the edges of the forest, as if searching for a sign or a shape. The flakes quickly thickened, swirling suddenly with the rising wind. Within a few moments, visibility dropped to barely a few feet. The world around me faded into a blur of white and gray. I turned back toward the cabin, heart pounding in the peculiar way it does when you realize you're far more isolated than you thought. The path I had taken earlier, clear and well-trodden, was already disappearing under the fresh blanket of snow. I forced my feet to move faster, crunching through the powder, but the cold was biting in my face, and my breath came out in sharp bursts. When I reached the cabin's porch, the door was frozen shut. I tugged at the handle, my fingers numb and clumsy. Panic began to rise. I had been so sure I could get inside before the storm worsened. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a sound I hadn't noticed at first, a low, almost human groan that seemed to rise and fall with the gusts. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to tell if it was just the wind playing tricks or something else entirely. The groaning stopped for a moment, and then I heard it again, clearer this time. It wasn't the wind, not exactly. It was deeper, more deliberate. I stepped back, scanning the yard for the source. The snow was swirling so thick now that I could barely see the shapes of the trees. I was about to try the door again when a sudden movement caught my eye, something dark, slipping between the trunks. I blinked hard, but it was gone. Maybe a stray animal, I told myself, but my skin prickled with unease. I tried the door again, jiggling the handle with more force. After a few tense seconds, it gave way, and I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me. The wind slammed against the walls like a living thing desperate to get in. I leaned against the door, heart racing, listening to the storm's fury outside. The cabin was dim and silent, the only light coming from the small fire pit in the corner, where a few embers still glowed faintly. I knelt down and blew on them gently, coaxing the fire back to life. The warmth spread slowly, but the sense of dread didn't ease. I moved to the window and peered out into the storm. The snow was falling so hard now it was like a wall, swallowing the world beyond the glass. The groaning sound came again, muffled but unmistakable, as if it was right outside, just beyond the snowdrifts. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just the wind caught in the trees, but my gut said otherwise. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching and waiting. The power flickered once, then went out entirely, plunging the cabin into near darkness. I found my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting a narrow path through the gloom. The storm raged louder, rattling the windows and pushing cold air through the cracks around the door. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to keep warm, but the unease gnawed at me. I realized I hadn't heard any bird calls or animal noises since the storm worsened, The woods were eerily quiet except for that groaning. Suddenly, a sharp tapping started at the window. I froze, staring at the glass. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned my flashlight toward the window. There was nothing there but swirling snow and the faint outline of a tree branch. Then the tapping shifted to the door. My heart slammed against my ribs as I grabbed a heavy chair and stood near the entrance, ready to defend myself if needed. The tapping continued, steady and insistent, and then suddenly stopped. Silence fell over the cabin, broken only by the storm's howl outside. I waited, breath held, but nothing else came. I sank to the floor, shaking. The fire crackled softly, throwing flickering shadows against the walls. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, telling myself the storm was playing tricks on me, that the tapping was just branches or ice falling. But then I thought of the footprints I had seen earlier. They hadn't been mine. They were too large, too deep, and they came from the forest's edge toward the cabin, stopping abruptly at the door. I didn't want to believe it. The logical part of my mind insisted it was just animals or falling debris, but every fiber of me screamed that there was something more. Something waiting out there in the snowdrifts, something that had followed me here. The storm showed no sign of letting up. The temperature dropped sharply, and I felt the cold seeping through the cabin's thin walls. I wrapped myself in a blanket and moved to the far corner, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. Outside, the groaning returned, low and mournful, rising and falling like a living thing breathing in the storm. I closed my eyes, wishing for morning, for rescue, for anything to end this long night. But the snowstorm wasn't finished with me yet. The storm got worse overnight. I woke up to a gray blur pressing against the window pane, the world outside swallowed by thick, relentless snow. The wind had picked up, rattling the thin glass with a persistent, guttural howl that seemed to shake the very frame of the cabin. I lay there for a while, listening, trying to convince myself that I was safe, that the storm was just weather, nothing more than a natural event. But the cabin felt smaller somehow, closed in, as if the snow was a living thing, pushing in on every side. I got up and went to the window again. The world was a white wall. The trees around the cabin were bent under the weight of ice and snow, their branches scraping against each other like bones. I could barely make out the edge of the driveway, or what used to be the driveway. The snow had already covered it completely. I knew I wouldn't be going anywhere today, and that thought brought with it a creeping dread I couldn't shake. I tried to keep busy. I checked the wood stove, adding some logs to keep the fire alive. The warmth was comforting, but even inside, the cold seemed to seep in through the walls and floorboards, a biting chill that crept under my skin and settled in my bones. I spent the morning pacing, trying to keep my mind off the isolation, but all I could think about was being trapped. I glanced at the clock more times than I cared to admit. By midday, the storm showed no sign of letting up. The wind was like a wild animal, shrieking and tearing through the trees. Every so often, a loud crack echoed through the forest, a tree limb giving way or perhaps the whole tree splitting under the weight of the snow. Each sound made me jump. I was too far from help. There was no cell signal, no way to call anyone. The only connection to the outside world was the old radio on the table, which had been my lifeline since I arrived. I turned it on, hoping for a weather update, but all I got was static. I fiddled with the dial, heart pounding every time I thought I heard a voice break through the white noise. Once, I caught a muffled voice mentioning whiteout conditions and travel advisories, but no solid information. The power had flickered a few times this morning, but the generator was still running. I felt a small relief in that, though I knew it might not last. As the afternoon dragged on, the loneliness began to gnaw at me. I paced the small cabin, stopping by the window often to peer out into the gray wasteland. Then, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the snow or a shadow cast by a tree limb, but no, I saw a figure, moving slowly through the storm. It was just beyond the reach of the porch light, a blurry shape stumbling through the deep snow. My breath caught. Who could be out there in a storm like this? I almost told myself I was imagining it, but the figure was definitely real. I grabbed my coat and boots, my mind racing. I needed to know if someone was hurt, lost, or worse. I pulled on every layer I had, shoved on a hat and scarf, and forced myself outside. The cold hit me like a wall, sharp and unforgiving. Snow whipped at my face, and the wind threatened to knock me off my feet. I squinted, trying to make out the figure, but the storm was relentless. Step by step, I moved forward, sinking into the snow with every footfall. The figure didn't seem to notice me, or maybe couldn't. They were hunched over, dragging something behind them, or perhaps just struggling to keep their balance. My heart pounded in my chest, half hope, half fear. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the storm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I closed the distance. It was a man, pale, wet, and trembling. His clothes were soaked through, and he looked like he hadn't eaten in days. When he turned his head, I saw the wild desperation in his eyes. He didn't speak at first, just looked at me like I was a lifeline. I helped him inside the cabin, wrapping him in blankets and sitting him near the fire. He shivered uncontrollably, mumbling broken words. Between his gasps and coughs, I caught fragments: lost, car, snowdrift, haven't slept. His name was Mark, he said, though I'm not sure how much I believed him. The storm had driven him off the road, and he'd been wandering for hours, maybe days. He said the snow had swallowed his car, and he didn't know where he was. I listened, trying to keep calm, but a part of me was screaming that this was no accident. The way he looked at me, haunted and hollow, made me question everything. As the night deepened, Mark grew weaker, his story growing more fragmented. The storm outside seemed to wrap tighter around the cabin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. The silence between the gusts of wind was thick, oppressive. I kept glancing toward the door and windows, half expecting something to appear in the storm's gray veil. Hours passed. The fire died down, and Mark finally fell asleep. I sat nearby, listening to the creaks and groans of the cabin as the wind battered it. The shadows cast by the flickering flames twisted and lengthened, and I realized I hadn't heard a single bird or animal all day. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the wind shifted. The sound of something scraping against the side of the cabin made me jump. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, shining the beam into the white chaos outside. Nothing. Just the relentless snow. But then, faintly, I thought I saw footprints, lines in the snow that hadn't been there before. They started at the edge of the tree line and led to the cabin's porch. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone out here, not with Mark, not anywhere. The storm was a cover, but something was out there, watching, waiting. I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire, flashlight in hand, eyes darting to every corner. The storm howled, and the owls groaned. Each time the wind slammed against the walls, I thought I heard a whisper, a breath, a movement just beyond sight. The snowstorm had trapped us, but something far darker had come with it. I didn't know what it was yet, but I felt it in my bones. This night was only the beginning. The storm didn't let up. If anything, it grew worse, the wind howling like a pack of desperate animals tearing at the walls of the cabin. I had never seen snow fall so thickly, as if the sky itself was crumbling and sending its cold shards down to bury the earth. The windows, once clear enough to see the trees swaying darkly outside, were now frosted and opaque, blotting out everything beyond the small circle of light cast by the dim lamp in the corner. I sat, shivering, though the fire in the hearth still burned low and steady. I could feel the cold creeping through the logs, slipping in through cracks and settling into the old wood. I tried to focus on the steady rhythm of the flames licking the blackened stones, but the silence between gusts was suffocating. I hadn't meant to stay this long, trapped inside that wooden box of a cabin, but the snow had sealed me in like a tomb. At first, I thought the storm would pass by morning, like most storms do. But by the time the sun should have risen, all I could see was an unchanging wall of light, pressed tight against the glass. I was running out of food and fuel, and I hadn't heard a sound from the main road since I'd arrived. My cell phone, miraculously still alive despite the cold, showed no signal. I was alone. I felt that weight in my chest, the kind that presses down hard enough to steal your breath. I tried to keep myself busy. I moved around the cabin, checking the windows, making sure none had cracked under the icy pressure. I restoked the fire, stacking kindling carefully, careful not to smother the flames. The wind rattled the shutters, making a sound like nails scraping on bone. Each time it happened, I jumped, my heart hammering in my ears. I knew the storm wasn't the only thing making me uneasy. There was something else out there, something that settled itself in the shadows just beyond the trees, waiting. I could feel it watching. Earlier, I had heard the distant crack of a tree falling, a sound that echoed sharply through the frozen forest. That was the first time I noticed the strange silence that followed, a silence so complete that even the snow seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement. A flutter of branches, a shadow shifting just beyond the reach of the porch light. But when I looked directly, there was nothing but the snow swirling in the cold air. I told myself it was my imagination, conjured by the isolation and the storm. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The darkness folded around the cabin like a shroud, and the howling wind carried with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. I checked the door again. It was locked tight, the old iron bolt rusted but sturdy. The windows were sealed with the thick wooden shutters. Nothing could get in, I thought, but the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire, on my breathing. The storm had been raging for hours now, and exhaustion was beginning to take hold. The cold had seeped deep into my bones, and I wrapped myself in the thin blanket I'd brought with me, sitting close to the fire. Still, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. Someone or something wanted my attention. I stood, moving slowly toward the door. I placed my hand on the rough wood, feeling the vibration of the taps against my palm. A chill ran down my spine as the wind burst through a crack in the shingles, sending a sudden gust that shook the cabin. The tapping stopped. Silence slammed down again, heavy and suffocating. I waited, breath caught in my throat, but nothing came. I backed away and sat down, trying to calm myself. Maybe the tapping had been nothing. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on the old cabin. But then, from the far side of the room, I heard it again, a faint scrape, like something dragging across the floorboards. I froze, listening. The fire flickered, shadows dancing against the walls, but there was no sign of movement. I told myself I was imagining things, that the sound was the owl settling. But then the door creaked. It was a slow, deliberate groan, the hinges straining under pressure. I grabbed the poker from the hearth and crept toward the entrance, heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would betray me. The door didn't open, but the sound was enough to send a fresh wave of panic crashing over me. I pressed my back against the opposite wall, gripping the poker tightly. Minutes passed. The storm outside continued its furious assault, snow piling higher, pressing in on every side. The cold felt closer now, like a hand reaching through the walls. I could sense the weight of the night pressing down, thick and heavy, wrapping itself around me. The tapping started again, this time softer, almost a whisper. I forced myself to stand, moving toward the window to peer outside. The glass was frosted solid, and through the dim light, I thought I could make out a shape, a dark figure standing just beyond the edge of the porch, unmoving. My breath caught, and I blinked hard. When I looked again, the figure was gone. I pressed my hand to the glass, the cold biting through to my skin. I stepped back and turned to the fire, trying to steady my shaking hands. The lamp flickered, then went out, plunging the room into darkness save for the fire's dying glow. A sudden crash from outside made me jump, a tree limb breaking under the weight of the snow, I told myself. The storm was relentless. I sat back down, pulling the blanket tighter around me. The tapping stopped. The silence returned. But I knew it was still there. Waiting. Eventually, I drifted into a fitful sleep, curled near the hearth, the fire shrinking to glowing embers. In the depths of the night, I thought I heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside, slow and deliberate. I woke with a start, heart hammering, but the cabin was still. The snowstorm had swallowed everything again, leaving only the sound of the wind and the cold pressing in on all sides. When morning finally came, weak and gray behind the thick curtain of snow, I was still inside, still trapped. The storm had buried the world beneath a white grave. And whatever had come for me in the night was still out there, watching, waiting for the quiet moment when I might let my guard down. I knew then that this storm wasn't just a test of endurance. It was a trap, and I was its prey. The snow had been falling relentlessly for hours by the time I realized just how trapped I was. The windows, once offering a view of the quiet woods, were now thickly frosted over, blocking out any hint of daylight. The storm had come on so fast I barely had time to react, and now the house felt less like shelter and more like a tomb. I paced the cramped living room, every creak of the old floorboards echoing off the walls like some dark warning. When I first arrived, I thought coming here, this abandoned cabin at the edge of the forest, was a good idea. A chance to be alone, to think, to escape the noise of the city and the weight of everything I'd left behind. Now, as the wind howled against the walls and the snow piled up in great drifts against the door, I knew I had been foolish. The storm wasn't just weather. It was a force that pressed down, suffocating and relentless. I tried the door again, the cold metal handle slick beneath my fingers. Frozen shut. No way in, no way out. I glanced toward the tiny kitchen, where a few frozen cans of beans and a nearly empty bottle of water sat neglected on the counter. I pulled the curtains back slightly to peer outside. The world was white and silent, the trees bowed low under the weight of the snow. No sign of a road, no footprints, no tracks. Nothing but the storm. My breath came out in heavy clouds, and I realized my fingers were numb despite the thick gloves I'd worn inside. The heat from the wood stove had faded hours ago, and I hadn't thought to check the fuel supply. I'd used the last bit of wood earlier, trying to keep the cold at bay, but the fire had sputtered out. The house was growing colder, and I could feel the chill creeping into my bones. I considered going upstairs again, hoping the smaller rooms might hold some forgotten warmth. The staircase groaned beneath my weight. I took the flashlight from my pocket and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The bedroom was bare except for a mattress stained with age and a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. I shivered and shone the light across the floor, searching for anything useful. A pair of dusty boots caught my attention near the door. I slipped them on. They were stiff, but better than nothing. Coming back downstairs, I realized how silent everything had become. The storm reached outside, but inside the house, there was no noise, no ticking clock, no dripping water, no settling creaks. Just an oppressive stillness that pressed in on me from all sides. I tried to focus on practical things. If I was going to survive here, I needed a plan. First, the fuel. I grabbed my coat and boots and pushed open the back door just enough to see the woodpile beneath the small overhang. Snow was settling thick on the logs, but some were dry enough to use. I hefted a few inside and stacked them near the stove. Striking a match was harder than I'd expected. The air was damp, and my fingers were shaking, but eventually a flicker caught and the fire roared to life. The warmth was immediate, sharp enough that I could feel it seeping through my gloves and into my fingers. I sat down near the stove, rubbing my hands together. It was only then I noticed the sound of faint tapping, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. I froze. The storm was the only thing that should be out there, but this tapping was deliberate, rhythmic, and slow. I strained to listen, but the wind drowned it out just as quickly as it appeared. I walked to the window and peered outside again. The snowstorm was blinding. The only shapes were the bent outlines of trees and the white blur of the landscape. Nothing moved. No shadows flickered. But the tapping persisted, soft now, almost like a heartbeat, steady and unnerving. I closed the curtains and backed away, my skin prickling. I wanted to tell myself it was the wind, maybe branches hitting the side of the house, but the sound felt too purposeful, too direct. I sank back into the chair, clutching the edge like a lifeline. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. I wasn't sure anymore. The storm was a hypnotic presence, lulling me into a trance where every sound was magnified and every silence screamed. I tried to keep track of time by watching the fire burn down, but the flames flickered low and the smoke began to curl toward the ceiling in slow spirals. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the front door. I jumped, heart hammering, and ran to the entrance, peering through the frosted glass. There was nothing but the swirling snow. I swallowed hard and forced myself to open the door a crack. A blast of icy air hit my face, and the snow swirled inside. I closed it quickly, locking it with trembling hands. I debated whether to call for help, but my phone had no signal, dead as the woods beyond. I was utterly alone. Panic set in, and I felt the walls closing in around me. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch and twist, turning into something less familiar, more sinister. Then I heard it again, the tapping, this time from inside the cabin. I whipped around, shining the flashlight wildly. The beam landed on the wall opposite the door, where a small picture frame hung crookedly. My hand trembled as I moved closer, heart in my throat. The frame was empty, the glass cracked. A sudden chill swept the room, and I caught a faint whisper, like breath against my ear. I spun, but no one was there. The house felt alive, shifting in the shadows. I backed into a corner, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The tapping grew louder, echoing through the walls, resonance in the floorboards. It wasn't random, more like a signal, a call. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen. The storm outside hammered against the house, but the terror inside was something else, something ancient and hungry. I tried to steady my breathing, forced myself to think. If I waited out the storm, someone might come. But the tapping, the whispering, they felt like warnings. Maybe the storm wasn't the danger. Maybe it was what the storm had brought with it. I sat back down, eyes fixed on the cracked glass. The tapping slowed, then stopped. Silence swallowed the room again, thick and suffocating. I stayed awake through the night, listening, waiting, trapped between the howling storm and the creeping dread that something was waiting just outside, or worse, inside, with me.